Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I remember the day like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget it. It was supposed to be an ordinary trip, a simple afternoon drive through the countryside with my wife. We had rented a small, quirky cabin tucked away by a lake, a few hours from home. The idea was to escape the noise of the city and just spend some quiet time by the water. The drive there was uneventful. The winding roads were flanked by endless fields and dense forests. We passed a few scattered towns, but otherwise saw no one. It felt serene, almost like stepping back in time. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the landscape. The place was exactly as advertised. Isolated, surrounded by towering trees, with the lake just a short walk away. We unpacked, made some tea, and sat on the porch, listening to the birds and the distant hum of insects. By evening, we ventured down to the lake. It was calm, the water reflecting the colors of the sunset. We decided to take a walk along the shore, hand in hand, soaking in the peaceful atmosphere. That's when it started. It began with faint whispers carried on the breeze. I didn't say anything at first, but I felt it, like someone was talking just out of earshot. I glanced at my wife, and I could tell she had heard it too. We stopped and looked around, but there was no one in sight. The whispers continued, growing louder, though the breeze was the only thing disturbing the stillness. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," I replied, trying to keep calm, but my stomach twisted in knots. We decided to turn back toward the cabin. The feeling of being watched had become overwhelming. The whispering followed us, now indistinct, like murmurs too faint to understand. It felt like the trees themselves were watching. Back at the cabin, we locked the door and sat close together on the couch, trying to shake off the sense of unease. The whispers had stopped, but the silence now felt oppressive, as though something was waiting just beyond our perception. Later that night, after we had gone to bed, it happened again. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate steps. I sat up, straining to hear. The wooden floor creaked under heavy, uneven movement. I nudged my wife awake, and we both listened, our ears pressed to the wall. The footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin as if something was moving around, studying us from the outside. "Is someone out there?" my wife whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My throat was dry. The steps continued, now sounding closer, more distinct. I could hear breathing now. Slow, shallow breaths that didn't belong to any living person. In a desperate attempt to break the tension, I grabbed my phone to call for help. But the screen stayed black. No signal. Nothing. My hands shook as I set it down. Then came a new sound. The knocking. Soft at first, but persistent. The knocks came from the windows, as though something was testing them, probing, searching for a way in. I pressed my back against the bed, the cold wall pressing against my skin. It was like they knew we were there. The knocking grew louder, more aggressive. The whispers returned, but this time they were right outside. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was as though whatever was out there was trying to tell us something. Something we couldn't hear, something we couldn't comprehend. After what felt like hours, the noises stopped as abruptly as they had started. The silence that followed was almost worse. My wife and I sat motionless, afraid to move. Eventually, we must have drifted back to sleep, though the unease lingered with us. In the morning, there was nothing. No trace of anyone or anything. The lake was calm, the trees stood still, and the whispers had faded with the night. But I know what I heard, what we both experienced. And even now, when I think about it, I feel the weight of those moments, of something that wasn't meant to be there, something that was watching, waiting. I never understood what it was, and I hope I never have to again. I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low, as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. The night of the power outage was supposed to be like any other. I had decided to visit the nearby park for an evening walk, something I did regularly to clear my head. The park was large, surrounded by woods, and during the day it was a peaceful place, but at night it took on a different feel. Isolated, mysterious. It was around 10 p.m. when I arrived. The air was crisp, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my feet. The park was completely empty. Not a single light from any street lamp or building. The power had gone out in the entire area earlier that evening, casting everything in deep, unnatural darkness. I didn't mind the quiet at first. In fact, it felt kind of serene. I continued walking down the main trail, the stars above me barely illuminating the path. It was peaceful, but something about the absence of light made the woods feel heavier, more oppressive. The trees loomed closer, casting long, distorted shadows that shifted with the breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. A chill ran down my spine as I stopped and glanced around. The park was vast, stretching farther than I could see in the darkness. I told myself to stop being paranoid, but the silence was so complete it felt as though something was watching, waiting. I had no phone service, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. I picked up my pace, walking faster. My breath fogged in the cold air, and the woods seemed to close in more with each step. That's when I heard it, the sound of faint rustling behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Just trees, shadows stretching endlessly. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. No response. I listened harder, straining my ears, but the only thing I could hear was the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, nerves frayed. The trail twisted and turned, and soon I found myself farther from where I had entered. The forest seemed to grow denser, darker. I couldn't see the path anymore, the trees too thick. I stopped, realizing I was lost. Panic set in. I turned around, hoping to retrace my steps, but the trail behind me had vanished. It was as though the woods had swallowed it whole. I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, as though something was lurking just beyond my vision, unseen but present. I tightened my jacket around me and forced myself to breathe, trying to calm my racing thoughts. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It sounded like my name. I froze. My stomach twisted, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but something told me otherwise. My name echoed once more, softer this time, as though the air itself was speaking it. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. No response. My heart pounded louder now, a deafening rhythm in the stillness. The whisper came again, closer this time, so close I could feel it brushing against my ear. I stumbled backward, bumping into something solid, something that shouldn't have been there. I spun around and froze. In front of me stood a figure, draped in what looked like tattered, flowing fabric. Its face was hollow, devoid of features, and its eyes gleamed faintly with an otherworldly light. It was taller than any person, and its presence felt ancient, unnatural. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure took a slow step forward, and I realized it wasn't walking. It glided, as though floating just above the ground. The woods seemed to press in around me, closing tighter, until there was nothing but the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, from behind me, I heard a voice, low and hollow. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around again, but there was no one there. The figure had vanished. I stood there trembling, my mind unable to comprehend what I had just seen. I turned and stumbled away from the spot, not looking back. The woods seemed endless, but somehow I found my way back to the edge of the park. By the time I made it home, the sun was beginning to rise. I never went back to that park again. My friends and I had been planning a hiking trip for weeks, a chance to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the quiet, untouched beauty of the mountains. We were tired of screens and the constant noise of everyday life. This would be our chance to disconnect and recharge. The trailhead was only about an hour's drive from town, and we arrived just as the sun was beginning to set. The air was crisp, and the towering pines stretched endlessly in every direction. The trail was well worn, though not overly crowded. It was perfect. As we started the hike, the conversations flowed, and we basked in the sounds of nature, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet, the soft rustling of leaves, and the distant call of birds. We decided to set up camp a few miles in, beside a stream that meandered through the forest. The spot felt isolated and peaceful, exactly what we were looking for. As we set up our tents and built a fire, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle, a faint rustling in the underbrush. I figured it was just some wildlife, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But as the evening deepened, the sounds grew more distinct. It wasn't just the rustling anymore. There were footsteps, quiet at first, but steady, following us. I stopped and turned around, expecting to see one of my friends, but no one was there. The woods were still except for the distant hum of insects. I didn't say anything to the others. I didn't want to worry them, but my nerves were already fraying. Every step we took, I felt like we were being watched. The sounds of the forest, which had been so comforting earlier, now felt oppressive. It wasn't just wildlife out there anymore. By the time we made it to camp, the shadows had grown long and deep. The fire we built crackled loudly, and we huddled close, trying to keep warm. I kept my eyes on the tree line, expecting to see someone emerge, but nothing ever came. It wasn't until later, after we had settled in, that I noticed something strange. The footsteps, whatever was following us, they had stopped. The forest was silent once again, but it wasn't a comforting silence. It felt wrong, hollow, as though something had vanished. I woke up a few hours later, shivering. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, but the night was still warm. I stepped out of my tent, hoping some fresh air would calm me. As I stood there, looking at the quiet trees, I noticed something bizarre. The usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets, were gone. The forest was completely still. Then I heard it, a soft, uneven breathing. It was coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line. My blood ran cold. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the dark. The breathing grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It was shallow, labored, almost as if whatever was out there was struggling to draw air. The sound wasn't far from where we had camped, but the direction was unclear. I felt like whatever was out there was looking for us, and now that it had found us, it was circling closer. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something. Those footsteps earlier, they weren't just following us. They were guiding something toward us, toward the camp. I could feel the presence growing closer. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I wake my friends? But what could I tell them? I didn't want to put them in more danger than they already were. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the woods, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. For a moment, there was nothing, just the endless shadows and the faint rustling of leaves. And then I saw it. A figure. Tall, obscured by darkness but unmistakable. Its form wasn't human. It seemed wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. It stared at me from the edge of the trees, unmoving, its hollow eyes glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. My heart thudded in my chest as I stared back, frozen in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure took a step forward, and I could see now, the uneven, staggering gait as if it wasn't fully human. The outline of its face was blurred, almost as if it wasn't meant to be seen. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished into the woods. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. My friends never woke up. By dawn, I convinced myself that whatever it was gone. I woke them and told them we needed to leave, that I wasn't feeling well. None of them questioned it. We hiked out of the forest, and I've never gone back. I've tried to convince myself it was just fear and exhaustion, that I imagined everything. But even now, I can't forget those hollow eyes staring from the darkness. Whatever it was, I don't believe we were alone that night. It was a warm summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a trip to a nearby lake. The lake was small, tucked away between rolling hills and dense forests. It wasn't particularly popular, more of a hidden gem that locals like to keep quiet. We had heard stories of how peaceful it was, a perfect spot to relax under the stars. I thought it would be a calm escape from the noise of everyday life, something we all needed. The drive there was quiet, the road winding through thick woods, the sun dipping low on the horizon. When we finally arrived, the lake stretched out before us, reflecting the orange glow of the setting sun. We set up a few blankets and chairs, unpacked a picnic, and watched as the last rays of light faded into the trees. For a while, everything felt idyllic. The air was cool, the breeze gentle. We ate, talked, and joked about the usual things: work, relationships, and what we'd be doing the rest of the summer. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional splash of water. As night began to fall, we could see the first stars starting to peek through the darkening sky. The only light was from our small battery-powered lantern. It cast long shadows across the shore. We decided to take a walk along the lakeside, following a narrow, worn trail that led into the woods. The path curved gently, the trees towering over us, their leaves whispering softly in the breeze. It was peaceful, serene. I told myself how lucky we were to have found this quiet escape, away from the chaos of the world. That's when things began to shift. We had been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we noticed something odd. The sounds of nature seemed off. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves. It was too quiet. Even the gentle lapping of the water against the shore had stopped. Maybe we went too far, one of my friends said, glancing nervously around at the darkening forest. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. It's probably just the woods settling. Happens sometimes. We kept walking, but my gut told me something wasn't right. The trees seemed closer now, more oppressive, their shadows stretching longer. The path itself had started to feel more narrow, as if the forest was closing in around us. Then came the first sound, low, distant, but unmistakable. A faint, unsettling whimper. I stopped in my tracks, listening. My friends turned to me, their faces pale. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered. I nodded, though my throat had gone dry. The sound came again, clearer this time. A soft, mournful cry like someone was in pain. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees and vanishing into the darkness. I'd never heard anything like it before. "We should go back," one of them said. Their voice was trembling, but before we could turn around, we heard it again. This time, much closer. It was like the cry was following us. My pulse quickened. I felt trapped, unable to shake the feeling that whatever was making that noise wasn't human. "Guys, we're too far in," someone said. "We need to get back. Now." But as we hurried to turn around, something caught my eye. A figure standing just beyond the edge of the trees. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. Its shape was twisted, distorted, and it seemed to blend with the shadows around it. I couldn't make out its face, just the faint glimmer of pale, empty eyes. I froze. My friends stopped too, noticing the same thing. None of us could speak, our breath catching in our throats as the figure took a step forward. It wasn't moving like a person. It was slow, deliberate, as though each step was agonizingly unnatural. The cry came again, louder, as if the figure were trying to communicate. Though what it wanted, I couldn't fathom. "Run," I whispered, and my voice cracked. Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted back toward the lake, the sound of our pounding footsteps echoing in the stillness. We didn't look back. When we finally reached the shore, we collapsed onto the blankets, gasping for air. The lake was still there, dark and calm under the moonlight, but the figure, whatever it was gone. None of us spoke for a long time. We packed up our things in silence, our minds racing. Whatever had been out there wasn't something we could explain, and part of me is still afraid it might still be watching. We haven't gone back to that lake. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore an old, abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. The park had been closed for decades, overgrown with weeds and forgotten by everyone. The faded, crumbling entrance sign seemed to scream out to us, promising something eerie and unknown. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. We wandered down the cracked paths, past the rusting remnants of broken rides. The Ferris wheel stood towering, skeletal and empty. Everything felt frozen in time, silent, lifeless and oddly oppressive. No laughter or music from forgotten years echoed through the park, only the distant creak of old metal and the occasional rustling of leaves. We kept moving deeper into the park, unsure of what we were hoping to find. It wasn't the typical thrill of the unknown. It felt darker. As we approached the old carousel, I noticed something odd. The wooden horses weren't just decaying. They seemed to have faces carved into them, hollow eyes, twisted grins. I instinctively stepped back, my pulse quickening. "What the hell is this?" someone whispered. We tried to laugh it off, but the unease was settling in too deeply. There were too many strange details, small things we couldn't ignore. The once bright colors of the rides had faded into drab, muted hues, and the air felt dense, as though it was pressing in on us. At one point, we came across an old photo booth. It was the only thing still relatively intact. The curtain was tattered, flapping in the wind, and the once vivid pictures printed from the machine were scattered across the floor. I bent down to pick one up, an image of a family smiling, frozen in time. But something wasn't right. The smiles were crooked, their eyes staring past the camera as if they were looking at something we couldn't see. Something about that photo sent a chill down my spine. I looked up, expecting to see my friends, but they had wandered off, further into the park. I hesitated for a moment before following them, clutching the photograph tightly. The deeper we went, the more things began to feel off. The sounds we had heard earlier, the creaking, the wind, began to shift into something unnatural. It wasn't just the rustling of leaves anymore, it was the faint, distant sound of laughter, but it wasn't coming from us. The laughter seemed to come from the depths of the park, distorted and hollow, echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It felt like it was all around us, but we couldn't see a source. My friends exchanged uneasy glances, but none of us dared to speak. We eventually found ourselves near the old roller coaster, once grand, now rotted and skeletal. The metal rails were twisted, dangling in midair like broken teeth. Below it, there was an old wooden bench covered in mold. A single flicker of something caught my eye, a small faded envelope resting on the bench. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and picked it up. It was sealed shut, but the paper was worn and fragile. I opened it carefully, revealing a single faded photograph inside. My breath caught in my throat. It was the same photo booth picture I had found earlier, a family frozen in time, but this one was different. The figures were closer, and their eyes weren't lifeless anymore. They were watching me, staring directly at me. Through the picture, as if they knew I had it, I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I glanced up, heart racing, and realized the laughter had stopped. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Suddenly, my friends were screaming from deeper within the park. "Run!" someone shouted. "Get out of here!" I didn't think twice. I shoved the photo back into the envelope and bolted, my legs pumping as the distant cries of my friends echoed in the distance. I didn't stop until I reached the entrance of the park. The moment I stepped onto the pavement, the air seemed lighter. but my heart was still pounding. I didn't dare look back. That night, back home, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The photo was still clutched tightly in my hand, the faces of the family still watching. I haven't been able to bring myself to throw it away. Whatever was out there in that park, whatever was left behind, it's still following me. I can feel it. And every night, I wonder if it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I still can't explain what happened that night, but I know it changed me. It started as an ordinary evening, one I'll never forget. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where everyone knew each other but no one really talked. I lived in a small apartment building that sat on the edge of town. There was a small green space between my building and the one next door, a small, overgrown park that most people seem to forget about. That night, I decided to go for a walk. Nothing strange about that, just me, some headphones, and a desire to clear my head. The air was cool, the streets nearly deserted. As I wandered toward the park, something about the atmosphere felt off. It wasn't just the silence or the empty streets. It was a deeper, more unsettling feeling, like the world had shifted slightly off kilter. I arrived at the park and noticed how different it felt from the last time I'd been there. The grass was overgrown, weeds pushed through the cracks in the pavement. The air smelled strange, almost metallic like blood. I ignored it, telling myself it was just the city noise creeping into my thoughts. I took a few steps into the park, the faint glow of the streetlights flickering. Suddenly, I heard something, the sound of footsteps. My heart jumped as I turned around, expecting to see someone behind me. But there was no one. Just the empty path, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I shook my head, assuming it was my imagination, and started walking again. The crunch of gravel under my shoes felt too loud. That's when I noticed something strange. A figure standing at the far end of the park beneath one of the dim streetlights. It wasn't moving, just standing there, head tilted, staring at me. I froze. There was something off about the figure. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I could comprehend. The shape was distorted, elongated, like a tall black silhouette but with no discernible features. No eyes, no mouth, just pure darkness. The way it stood felt unnatural, as if it didn't belong to this world. I couldn't look away. My legs felt like stone, frozen in place as I watched this thing. It didn't seem to move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, cold and oppressive. Then, as if sensing my fear, the figure shifted, just slightly. Its body contorted in a way that seemed impossible, unnatural. It leaned toward me, and I swear I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I didn't want to wait around to find out what would happen next. I turned and bolted, my breath ragged as I sprinted back toward the street. My mind raced, trying to convince me that I had imagined the figure. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, locked safely behind the door. I sat there, the lights off, waiting for morning. My hands trembled as I replayed the figure in my mind. I don't know what I saw that night, but it wasn't human, and whatever it was, I can feel it still watching, waiting. It was late spring when I decided to take a trip to the old lighthouse. Located on a rocky outcrop overlooking the coast, it wasn't a place people visited often. Most locals whispered about how the lighthouse had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and doors rusted shut. Despite the warnings, I always had a fascination with places like this, forgotten, isolated, and steeped in mystery. I parked my car at the edge of the cliff and climbed over the low fence that marked the entrance. The air was salty and thick with the smell of the ocean. The lighthouse stood tall against the gray sky, its worn brick exterior covered in moss. It was both haunting and beautiful in the fading light. I pushed open the creaking metal door at the base of the structure and stepped inside. The staircase spiraled upward into darkness, so I pulled out a flashlight from my backpack. The beam flickered, casting shaky light against the old stone walls as I made my way up. Each step echoed around me, amplifying the silence. It felt as though the place had been waiting for me, abandoned and forgotten. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the air became, growing colder with each passing floor. By the time I reached the top, I was surrounded by the familiar smell of dust and decay. The view from the top was breathtaking. The ocean stretched out before me, waves crashing against the cliffs below. It was exactly what I had hoped for. The solitude, the silence. For a moment, I just stood there, absorbing the vastness of it all. But then I noticed something strange. In the distance, along the jagged coastline, there was movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but as I watched, it became clearer. A figure silhouetted against the horizon. They were standing there, unmoving, watching. My stomach tightened. I couldn't make out who or what they were, but there was something unnerving about the way they seemed to hold perfectly still. I tried to shake off the feeling, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I had read too many old ghost stories about this lighthouse after all. I turned back to the view, trying to distract myself, when I heard it, the faintest whisper carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear what was being said. The words were too soft, too distant, and yet they felt closer than they should have been. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. I shined it into the dark corners of the room, but there was nothing. Still, the whisper persisted, growing louder. Panic began to set in. I had never believed in ghosts, but now, alone atop this desolate lighthouse, I wasn't so sure. The figure from earlier was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It felt like something was breathing down my neck. I began to make my way back down the stairs, the flashlight trembling in my grip. With each creak of the old wood, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down harder. The whispers didn't stop, but now they seemed to be coming from within the walls themselves. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. The door I had entered through loomed ahead, the only way out. I tried to turn the handle, but it was stuck. I yanked at it, heart racing, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized something had locked me inside. Panic surged through me. I spun around trying to find another way out, but the only way was up. The whispers had grown into screams now, echoing through the narrow corridors, but there was no one there. I stumbled back toward the staircase, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a lifeline. I kept climbing, each step feeling heavier, each echo more deafening. It was only when I reached the top that I saw them again. The figure from earlier. They were inside now, standing at the base of the staircase, staring up at me. Their face was obscured by shadows, but I could feel their gaze, cold and unrelenting. There was no escape. I didn't scream. I didn't move. All I could do was watch as they began to ascend, their movements slow and deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. I had always loved nature, the quiet peace of being out in the open, surrounded by trees and distant mountains. One summer, my friends and I decided to spend the weekend hiking deep into a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no electricity, just us, the trail, and the wilderness. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and escape the noise of the world. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees with sunlight filtering through the canopy. We made good time, laughing and sharing stories, taking occasional breaks to catch our breath. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of the forest. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The sky was clear, the stars visible above us. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. We built a fire, cooked some food, and enjoyed the peace, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard it. A faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, listening. It wasn't coming from any of my friends. The voices were too distant, too faint, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, things had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. My friends noticed it too. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something we couldn't quite explain. While my friends were packing up, I wandered off to explore. The woods had always been my escape, but today something felt different. I followed a narrow path deeper into the trees, drawn by a sense of curiosity and unease. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, almost like they were watching. That's when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still among the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to make out at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in. I turned to run, but my legs felt frozen, heavy. I couldn't look away. The figure remained unmoving, its presence so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one. The woods were silent again. I didn't wait to find out what was following me. I ran back to camp, heart racing. My friends were there, gathering our things. I didn't want to scare them, so I kept what I had seen to myself. We left the clearing and continued down the trail, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, as we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light, my mind playing tricks, or something else entirely. But the figure, the feeling of being watched, those are memories that will stay with me forever. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature, but whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. It was a quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old cemetery. The thought of it used to make me uneasy, but over the years, I'd grown used to its stillness. It was nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by trees that loomed over the grave markers like silent sentinels. I used to come here whenever I wanted solitude, away from the noise of daily life. That night, something felt off. Even though I'd walked these grounds countless times, the air felt heavier, thicker. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dim gray light. I didn't see another soul around, which wasn't unusual. The place had long since fallen into disuse. The graves seemed older than I remembered, some barely legible, the inscriptions worn away by time. As I wandered through the rows, something caught my attention. Faint whispers, too quiet to make out but insistent. I strained my ears, expecting to hear nothing but silence, yet the whispers grew louder. Not words, just hushed murmurs as if someone was close, though I couldn't see anyone. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the wind was playing tricks on me. But the hairs on my neck stood up. The cemetery had always been quiet, peaceful, but tonight it felt like I wasn't alone. Then I saw him, or rather, it. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, blending with the shadows. A man, or at least I thought it was a man. He stood at the edge of a broken gravestone, motionless, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but felt. My heart pounded. I wanted to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, I could make out more of its features, or rather, the lack of them. There was no face, just a void where the eyes should have been, empty and black. It wasn't human, not anymore. My breath hitched and I realized I couldn't look away. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me, growing more insistent. The figure raised its hand, reaching toward me, and I felt something inside me snap. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart hammering in my chest. The graves blurred past me, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its presence closing in. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the woods, my legs giving out beneath me. I collapsed against a tree, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But the figure never followed. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to speak. The whispers faded, leaving only the silence. When I finally got to my feet and looked back, the cemetery was empty. The figure was gone, as if it had never been there. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't returned to the cemetery since. It was a quiet night at the old cinema. I was the only one working, the projectionist. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The theater itself was a relic, built decades ago with worn-out seats and a projector that creaked like an old ship. The movies were rarely popular anymore, but the few people who still came were loyal, regulars who didn't seem to mind the dust and the dim lighting. I liked the quiet, the solitude, but tonight, something felt off. The last showing had ended hours ago, and now I was in the projection room, staring at the faint glow of the reel spinning. I was about to shut down the projector when I heard it, the faintest noise. A whisper, almost too soft to hear, coming from the hall below. I froze, listening. The theater had been empty for hours, or at least I thought it had. The whisper wasn't just in my head, it was real, distinct. It came again, a voice barely above a breath. Help. I leaned closer to the edge of the projection room, peering down into the darkness. The hall was still. Nothing. My heart raced as I hesitated, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But the whisper came again, louder this time. Help. Please. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it wasn't from the films either. It wasn't part of the stories on screen. My breath caught in my throat, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I descended the stairs slowly, every step echoing in the vast, empty space. The whispers continued, now more distinct. I'm here. Please. I reached the main floor of the theater. The screen flickered faintly, casting long shadows in the dim light. The chairs were empty, just as they had been when the last film ended. Yet, the whispers came from the seats, as if someone, something, was sitting there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the voice. My eyes strained, trying to pierce the darkness. The whispers became clearer, more desperate. I can't get out. I turned my head, scanning the rows of seats, but saw no one. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. They were coming from beneath one of the seats. Trembling, I knelt down and lifted the seat. Beneath it, there was nothing, only the cold, bare floor. But the whispers were louder now, echoing in my ears as if they had no source at all. Panic gripped me. I wanted to run, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot. The whispers didn't stop. Help. Please. Then, suddenly, there was silence, complete and oppressive. My heart was hammering, and I clutched my chest, wondering if I'd imagined it all. That's when I saw it. A faint outline of a figure on the far side of the theater, barely illuminated by the screen. It was a shape, taller than a person, its form blending with the shadows. No face, just an empty void where eyes should be. Before I could react, the figure moved closer, drifting silently across the room. It didn't walk. It glided, like smoke being pulled through the air. My breath caught again, and I stumbled backward, my hand brushing against something cold. I turned, only to find an empty row of seats behind me. When I looked back, the figure was gone. The theater was still empty. The screen blinked, casting distorted reflections of the room onto itself, but the whispers had stopped. I didn't stay long after that. I locked up and left, never looking back. I never heard those whispers again. It was supposed to be a simple evening drive. The kind of drive that takes you out of the city and into the quiet, unfamiliar outskirts where there's nothing but endless fields and trees stretching out to the horizon. I had always enjoyed these drives, away from the noise, away from everything familiar. That night, I decided to take the back roads, hoping to clear my mind after a long day. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in shades of purple and orange. The road stretched before me, winding through rolling hills and fields that seemed to go on forever. For the first hour, everything felt peaceful. The radio played softly, the hum of the car was steady beneath me. But then, something shifted. The air seemed to grow colder, and I noticed that the horizon wasn't as far away as it once had been. The trees grew thicker, their shadows stretching across the road like dark sentinels watching me. I didn't think much of it at first, just the usual unease that comes with driving alone at night. But as I continued down the road, I started to notice strange shapes, figures standing still in the fields. They looked like people, but they didn't move, just standing there, watching. I tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe they were just trees or scarecrows someone had placed out there. But the longer I drove, the more certain I became that they weren't. These shapes were too still, too human. My heart began to race as I passed one of them. It was a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky. It was too far away to see any features, but I could feel its gaze as though it were right beside me. Just shadows, I whispered to myself, my hands tightening on the wheel. But then, something changed. One of the figures moved, just a twitch of its head, too subtle to be human. I slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. My eyes were locked on the figure as it took a slow, deliberate step forward. It was closer now, and I could see more clearly. A tall, thin shape, too long in its limbs, too unnatural in its stillness. Panic surged through me. I wanted to turn around, to get out of there, but my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I couldn't tear my eyes away from that figure. It took another step, its motion almost gliding like it wasn't walking but floating. Suddenly, more of them appeared. From the fields, from the woods, figures, countless figures, all standing silently. Their shapes were indistinct, but they all seemed to watch me with those impossible, still, hollow eyes. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The car felt too small, too confined. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. It was like they were closing in, stretching out across the empty landscape. Then, without warning, they began to advance. Step by step, they moved in sync, like a silent wave. They didn't run, they didn't scream, they just walked. I couldn't stay there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing, but there was no rational explanation for this. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, I slammed the car into reverse and sped back the way I came. The figures didn't chase me, but I could feel them still there, standing in the darkness, unmoving but ever present. When I finally reached the edge of the strange, endless fields, I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was home, locked in my room, the world outside seeming distant and foreign. To this day, I don't know what those figures were. Were they real? Were they something I imagined in my panic? All I know is that they were there, waiting, and they are still out there, somewhere. It started with a simple drive. I had always been fascinated by old lighthouses, drawn to their solitude and the stories they seemed to hold. So, one weekend, I decided to take a trip to an isolated one perched on a cliff by the sea. It was something I'd always wanted to do, something to escape from the noise of daily life. The lighthouse was miles away from any town or signs of human life. The drive to get there was long, winding through narrow, desolate roads with nothing but trees and rocky cliffs on either side. The closer I got, the more the world seemed to shrink. By the time I arrived, the sun had begun to set, casting a long, eerie glow over the water below. The lighthouse stood tall, its white paint peeling and windows dark. The air smelled of salt and brine, and the only sound was the crashing waves below. I parked my car and began the short hike up the steep path leading to the base of the lighthouse. The only other thing besides the distant roar of the sea was the silence that seemed to engulf everything. When I reached the entrance, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The inside was musty and cold, with narrow, spiraling stairs leading to the top. Each step groaned beneath my feet as I climbed. It wasn't long before I reached the top, where the view was breathtaking. The sea stretched out before me, endless and unforgiving. I stood there, lost in the beauty of it all, when something made me glance back toward the stairs. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing there, silhouetted against the narrow frame of the doorway. My stomach twisted, and my heart skipped a beat. But when I turned fully around, there was no one there. I told myself it was just the shadows playing tricks. The wind whistled through the small broken windows, and I shivered, forcing the creeping unease to the back of my mind. As I took in the view again, I thought about the stories of ships lost at sea, the lonely keepers who had watched from these towers for generations. The idea of isolation felt comforting until I realized that I wasn't alone. Not truly. There was something off about the silence, the absence of birds, the usual sounds of life. Everything was too still, the kind of silence that made your ears ring. I made my way back down the stairs, each creak of the wood beneath me echoing. When I reached the bottom, the door was shut. How had I not noticed that before? The door hadn't moved on its own. My heart raced again as I reached for the handle, only to find it locked from the inside. I was trapped. Panic hit me hard. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. The lighthouse stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ocean and cliffs. I tried to open the door, banging on it, shouting for help, but there was no one around. The sound of my own voice felt hollow in the empty space. I spent what felt like hours trying to find a way out, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something had sealed it behind me, something I couldn't see or understand. The fear grew, sinking into every part of me. The thought that I might be trapped here, in this ancient lighthouse where the echoes of the past lingered, was too much to bear. When I finally slumped to the floor, exhausted and hopeless, I noticed something strange. The silence seemed to have shifted. Not just quiet, it was as if the world itself had grown quieter. The air was still, heavy, as though time had stopped. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, when I heard it, the faint sound of a distant bell, soft and low. It wasn't coming from inside the lighthouse, it was from the sea. The bell rang again, louder this time. It echoed off the cliffs, and I couldn't tell if it was real or some strange, haunting memory. My stomach turned as I realized there was no ship in sight, no boat or rescue, just the sound of a bell calling from the void. Trembling, I stood up and went to the window, pressing my face against the cold glass. Below, far out on the water, I saw a flicker of light, dim, almost ghostly. It moved closer, but the lighthouse had no boats or ships. No life should have been out there. I forced myself to look away, but the bell continued, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks, but I knew one thing. The lighthouse wasn't just keeping watch over the sea, it felt like the sea was watching me. I never saw anyone outside, never found a way out, but the bell still echoes in my mind, always just out of reach. I don't know if anyone else heard it, or if I was the only one who ever would. It was the middle of summer when a group of friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to a nearby lake. None of us had ever been there before, but the promise of clear waters and warm sun was too tempting to pass up. The drive wasn't long, just far enough to feel like we were escaping the noise of the city, but not so far that we'd lose cell service. The day started perfectly. We arrived early, claiming a spot near the shore, and spent the afternoon swimming, laughing, and basking in the sunlight. The lake was calm, almost unnaturally so. The water was glassy and there wasn't a single ripple. It was eerie in its stillness, but we were too preoccupied with the warmth and the relaxation to give it much thought. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the water, we decided to go for one last swim before the evening cooled. The water was still as we dove in, and it felt refreshing. The perfect end to a perfect day. But as I swam further out, the light from the setting sun began to fade, and the water became darker. That's when I noticed something strange beneath me. It wasn't an object or a shadow. It was a presence. Something shifted below the surface, too far down for me to make out. My stomach twisted and I stopped swimming, treading water as my eyes strained into the depths. There was nothing visibly there, but I could feel it. A sensation like being watched, like something was studying me from beneath. "Hey," I called out to my friends, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "Can you guys feel that? Like something's down there?" They splashed and joked, completely unaware. I didn't tell them how much I wanted to get out of the water. The longer I stayed, the stronger the feeling grew. It was as if the lake itself had become a living, breathing entity, waiting. I swam back to shore, hurried and shaking off the cold, unsure if what I had felt was real. The others were still laughing, throwing a frisbee, soaking up the last of the day's warmth. I tried to forget about the sensation and told myself it was just my nerves playing tricks. As we started packing up to leave, I noticed something odd in the sand near our stuff. Tracks. Not footprints, though. Drag marks, deep and deliberate, leading from the water toward the woods. My heart stopped as I followed them with my eyes. They disappeared into the trees, where there was nothing but silence. I didn't say anything to my friends. I couldn't bring myself to. As we drove away, I kept looking back at the lake, the sun now fully set, casting a dark, brooding reflection. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I kept wondering, what was in that water? And whatever it was it still down there, waiting for us to return? I remember the night clearly, even though I wish I didn't. It wasn't like a typical horror story where something obvious happens and you can't look away. No, this was different. A quiet, unsettling terror that crept in slowly, unnoticed, until it was already too late. It started with an evening trip. A group of us decided to go for a hike up an old, abandoned mountain trail that no one in town really talked about anymore. The path was barely visible through the trees, and we figured it'd be fun to explore something that felt off the map. No one else had been there in years, from what we'd heard. The trail wasn't difficult at first, just some rocky terrain and patches of overgrown bushes. But as we kept walking deeper into the forest, something felt off. The air seemed thick, heavier. The usual sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves were replaced by a strange, oppressive silence. Even the forest itself felt strange, like it was watching us. We had been hiking for what felt like hours when we came across a clearing, a wide space surrounded by towering pines. There was an old, crumbling structure at the center of the clearing. It looked like a small, forgotten cabin, its roof partially caved in, and the walls worn with age. None of us had expected to find something like this out here. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt wrong. "We should check it out," one of my friends, Mark, said, stepping toward the cabin. The others hesitated, but curiosity got the better of us. The closer we got, the more uneasy I became. The silence seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself had swallowed all sound. The door of the cabin creaked open under our weight, revealing a room filled with dust-covered furniture and remnants of something long forgotten. We stepped inside, hesitant, but everything seemed still. There was nothing alive inside except for us. As we poked around, one of my friends, Laura, pointed out something strange. The walls were covered in old, faded drawings. Children's drawings, but they weren't the usual cheerful, innocent sketches. These were distorted, eerie, figures with hollow eyes, twisted shapes, and scribbled faces that seemed to stare at us from the faded paper. "That's creepy," Mark said, turning pale. We quickly decided to leave, but as we stepped outside, the feeling of unease only deepened. It wasn't just the creepy drawings or the old decaying cabin. It was something else. A presence. It wasn't threatening, but there was an undeniable sense that we weren't supposed to be there. We moved quickly through the woods, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had settled over us. The trail became steeper, harder to follow as we pressed on, and the oppressive silence grew even thicker. Then, as we were about to turn back, we heard it, the soft sound of footsteps behind us. But there was no one there. "Guys, stop," I whispered, turning around. The others froze. "I hear it too," Laura said, her voice barely above a whisper. The footsteps echoed faintly in the distance, like someone, or something, was walking just beyond the tree line, following us. We hurried, but the sound seemed to be growing closer, as though whatever was following us was keeping pace. No matter how far we went, the noise remained, distant but persistent. We couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we finally reached the trailhead, we stopped, breathing heavily. The trees loomed around us, shadows stretching long in the fading light. That's when I realized something was missing. One of my friends, Emma, was gone. "Where's Emma?" I asked, my voice trembling. The others looked at each other, panic setting in. We split up, calling her name, but the only response was silence. The woods had swallowed her, leaving us alone once again. We couldn't find Emma. We never did. She was just gone. There was no trace of her, no sign of where she might have gone. The forest had taken her, and we were too afraid to go back in and search again. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. All I know is that something was in those woods, something that watched us, followed us, and took Emma. And whatever it was, I'm convinced it's still out there, waiting. It was a calm afternoon, the kind where the heat seems to bend the air. My friends and I decided to take a trip to the local beach, a place we'd visited many times before, but something felt different this time. The sun glared down from a cloudless sky as we pulled into the empty parking lot. The beach wasn't far, just a short walk from the car, but there were fewer people than usual. We set up our towels and chairs, laughing as we dove into the cool water. The waves were gentle, the kind you don't think twice about. For a while, it felt like nothing could go wrong. We swam, played around, and enjoyed the simplicity of the day. It wasn't until later, when the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the shore, that things began to feel off. We were sitting on the sand, watching the horizon, when one of my friends suddenly pointed toward the water. "There's something out there," she said, her voice quieter than before. At first, I didn't see anything, just the vast expanse of blue stretching out to meet the sky. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out a figure far in the distance. It wasn't a person, not a swimmer or a surfer. It looked almost like a shadow, dark and indistinct, moving slowly beneath the surface. The water didn't ripple in the way waves normally do. It was as if something was swimming just beneath, something large, something unnatural. "Is it a shark?" one of my friends asked, but none of us could answer. We all stood there staring at the spot where the figure had been, but now it was gone. The beach had become unnervingly quiet, save for the faint lapping of the waves. The sun had all but disappeared, replaced by a faint orange glow on the horizon. It was beautiful in an eerie way, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was off. "We should go," someone said. The idea of walking back to the car felt like a relief, but we couldn't shake the unease. The path back to the parking lot was dark and desolate, lined with dunes on one side and endless ocean on the other. The air felt thick, heavier than before, and we walked in silence. Halfway back, we stopped. There was a sound, something faint but unmistakable. A splash, not far from the shore. It echoed in the quiet evening air. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood there, frozen, straining to hear anything else, but it was as if the world had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the faint sound of the waves. Then came the whispering. It started softly at first, almost like the wind, but we realized there wasn't any wind. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, whispers carried on the breeze. They were faint and incomprehensible, as if they were speaking in a language we couldn't understand. Panic gripped me. I could feel it in the way my heart pounded in my chest. We weren't alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. "We need to get back now," one of my friends said, her voice trembling. As we hurried to the car, the whispers grew louder, surrounding us. It was as though the entire beach was alive, breathing, and the sound of those whispers seemed to come from everywhere. I kept turning, scanning the dunes and the water, but saw nothing. Yet the voices remained, growing more insistent, more sinister. We finally made it to the car, fumbling with the keys, heartbeats thudding in our ears. The moment we slammed the doors shut, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Driving away, we didn't speak much. All I could think about was that figure beneath the water, the whispers that seemed to follow us, and how wrong the beach had felt. When I glanced back, the beach was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Whatever we saw that day, it's still out there, waiting. It started as an ordinary trip to the local library. My sister and I were always close, and we spent countless afternoons browsing through rows of old, dusty books. That day, the library felt emptier than usual. The shelves towered over us, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the wooden floor as we walked. We had made our way to the back of the library, past the quiet study rooms and the dimly lit reading areas. The air smelled like old paper and dust. As we wandered further into the maze of bookshelves, I noticed how still everything was. No whispers, no children running, just silence. Even my sister seemed more subdued than usual. "I'll meet you over there," she said, gesturing toward a section I wasn't particularly interested in. I watched her disappear behind a row of shelves, lost in a world of her own. I kept browsing, pulling a book off the shelf and flipping through the pages. Something about the stillness was unsettling. The library wasn't big, but today it felt like a labyrinth, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were the only ones there. I moved toward the back, deeper into the old section of the library where the shelves creaked beneath my feet. At the end of the row, something caught my eye. A table nestled in the corner, covered with old, dusty books. One of them wasn't like the others. The cover was worn, pages yellowed and brittle, but there was something different. Curious, I picked it up and dusted it off. The title was barely legible, faded with time. Whispers from the Void. My stomach sank. I opened the book, but the pages were blank, completely blank. A wave of unease washed over me, but I couldn't bring myself to put it down. As I flipped through the pages, a whisper escaped from the shadows behind me. I froze. The sound was faint. Just a whisper, but it wasn't from anyone I could see. The air shifted around me and I could feel eyes watching from the darkness. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the tall shelves stretching into the dim corners of the library. My heart thudded against my chest and I knew something wasn't right. The whispers grew louder, echoing through the silent aisles. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Only the low, endless whisper that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. I clutched the book tightly and began to back away. I had to find my sister. I needed to get out of there. The whispering followed me, trailing like a shadow. I moved as quickly as I could, my breath hitching with every step. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Suddenly, I heard my sister's voice from further down the hall. "Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?" Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Her voice sounded distant, echoing strangely. "I'm here," I yelled, but it felt hollow, as though my voice wasn't reaching her. "Where are you?" No response. The whispers grew louder, drowning out any trace of my sister's voice. I turned the corner, hoping to find her, but the library seemed to twist and stretch before my eyes. The rows of shelves seemed endless now, stretching far beyond what I remembered. "Please, just tell me where you are," I shouted, my voice breaking. Silence. And then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hall, but something was wrong. Her figure wasn't quite right. Her back was arched unnaturally, and she wasn't moving like she usually did. It was as if she were floating. "Please come back," I cried, my legs trembling as I rushed toward her. But as I drew closer, I noticed her face. It wasn't my sister's. The eyes that stared back at me were hollow, empty, devoid of anything human. A sinister grin stretched across her lips. "No," I whispered, backing away. The whispers filled the air once more, louder now, like a chorus of unseen voices. The library seemed to stretch endlessly around me, each shadow deeper and darker than before. I turned to run, but the endless corridors shifted, moving as if the library itself was alive. I couldn't escape. Then, from the depths of the shadows, I heard a voice, calm, serene, yet undeniably chilling. "You're not supposed to leave." I closed my eyes, clutching the book to my chest. When I opened them again, everything was silent. The whispers had stopped. The library was still, eerily quiet. But when I turned around, my sister was gone. And so was the book. It was a late summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old lighthouse on the edge of the coast. We had heard the stories about the place. The locals always mentioned strange things happening out there, but none of us believed in the so-called haunted lighthouse tales. We were just looking for an adventurous night, something to break the monotony of our usual weekends. The lighthouse stood on a narrow stretch of rocky coastline, rising above the crashing waves. The air was thick with salt, and the horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, the sun dipping into the dark sea. We parked the car a few hundred feet from the lighthouse and started walking the narrow gravel path that led up to it. The wind was fierce, tearing at our jackets, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below echoed like a low, persistent hum. It was eerie, but we all just laughed it off, attributing it to the remoteness of the place. When we reached the base of the lighthouse, the first thing I noticed was how worn down it looked. The old white paint was peeling, revealing patches of weathered stone beneath. It felt abandoned, yet oddly familiar. We climbed the spiral staircase inside, the sound of our footsteps clattering against the cold metal steps. At the top, the view was stunning. The sun had fully set by now, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple, the stars beginning to emerge. We stood there, leaning against the railing, mesmerized by the vastness of the ocean stretching out before us. But that's when I noticed something unusual. It wasn't just the beauty of the view, it was the silence. No seagulls, no distant boats, no wind. It was as though the world had stopped. "Did anyone else hear that?" I asked, breaking the quiet. They all turned, confused. "Hear what?" someone replied. "I don't know. It's too quiet. It's unnatural." As the minutes dragged on, we stood there staring out at the horizon. The air felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, standing on the edge of the cliff. My breath hitched. "Is that someone out there?" I whispered, pointing. None of them saw it. The figure was silhouetted against the dark sea, motionless, as if waiting. I rubbed my eyes, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, but it didn't move. And then, just as suddenly as I'd seen it, the figure was gone. I glanced at my friends, but they were still oblivious, staring out at the sea. Maybe it's just my eyes playing tricks, I said, trying to brush it off. But my heart still pounded, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We made our way down from the lighthouse, the night feeling heavier than before. The walk back to the car was silent. None of us spoke much, the weight of whatever we had seen still lingering in the air. It wasn't until we got back to town and were sitting in the diner, hours later, that things took an even stranger turn. One of my friends, Mark, suddenly leaned forward, his face pale. "Did anyone else feel like we weren't the only ones up there?" His voice was low, almost trembling. We all looked at him, nodding slowly. Every single one of us had the same feeling. That figure we'd seen wasn't something imagined. That figure. What if it wasn't human? I asked quietly, the unease washing over me again. The room grew silent. That's when it hit me. The stories we had dismissed earlier about the lighthouse being haunted came rushing back. What if they were true? What if whatever that figure was had been watching us all night? We never went back to that lighthouse, and even now, I wonder if something still watches from the cliffs at night, waiting for the next visitors to stumble upon its lonely, desolate shores. It was a quiet evening, and I had decided to go for a walk along the old, unused rail trail that ran near the edge of town. The trail had been out of service for decades, overgrown with thick underbrush and left to the elements. A relic from another time, it was now little more than a forgotten path through the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. I didn't expect to run into anyone. The town had grown quiet in recent years, and I figured it was the perfect time to clear my head. There wasn't much to hear other than the distant sound of the trees rustling in the wind and the occasional creak of an old sign swaying overhead. As I walked further along the trail, a chill started to settle in my bones. It wasn't just the cold air. There was something off about the silence, something unnatural. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming my nerves, and pressed on. About halfway down the trail, I came across an old wooden bench. It was weathered and half-rotted, covered in moss and dirt. I decided to sit for a moment, pulling my jacket tighter around me. The woods around me seemed darker now, the shadows deeper, the wind sharper. I glanced up at the fading light of the horizon, the last hint of twilight vanishing into the thick trees. That's when I heard it. A faint, barely audible whisper carried on the wind. I strained to hear, but there was nothing. Just the silence again. Maybe my imagination, I thought. But then, a second whisper, closer this time, like it was coming from the trees behind me. My breath hitched and I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. I turned slowly, my pulse quickening. The woods were still. The trees loomed over the trail like silent sentinels, their branches creaking and swaying. I told myself to calm down, that it was probably just an animal. But deep down, I knew better. There was no animal making those whispers. It was like something, or someone, was trying to call out to me. I tried to walk away from the bench, but the whispers followed. They were louder now, as if they were closing in on me, their words indistinct but somehow menacing. I glanced behind, but there was nothing. Only the trees, silent and watchful. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into the shadows. I kept moving, but the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to come from all directions now, surrounding me like a dark fog. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Was I losing my mind? Or was something out there? Something beyond explanation. Suddenly, I tripped over something in the grass, falling hard onto the dirt path. My hands scraped against the ground as I caught myself. Looking down, I saw it. A small, broken mirror lying face up, shards of glass reflecting nothing but my terrified expression. The whispers turned to a low, guttural whisper, almost like a chant. It wasn't in any language I recognized, but I could feel it resonating in my bones. I scrambled to my feet, my heart thudding wildly in my chest. That's when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the trees. They weren't human, but they moved like people. Tall and hunched, their forms twisted and obscured by the dark. Their eyes glowed faintly, empty and hollow. They didn't speak, but their whispers continued, growing louder. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my legs felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The shadows moved closer, closing in on me like a wave of darkness. Then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they stopped. The whispers faded, and the figures vanished into the trees once more. I stood there, breathless, staring into the darkness. When I dared to move again, there was nothing, only the echo of silence. The mirror lay shattered on the ground, its broken glass reflecting nothing but the void of the forest. I didn't stay long after that. I turned around and walked back, never looking over my shoulder again. It was a quiet Sunday evening when my family decided to take a drive out to the old lake. The air was crisp, the sky painted with soft hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The lake had always been a place of peace, a spot where we'd spent countless weekends, swimming, fishing, and simply enjoying the stillness. We packed a small cooler, grabbed some snacks, and set out in the late afternoon. The drive was familiar, the roads winding and quiet, with only the occasional passing car. As we approached the lake, something felt different. The usual sense of tranquility was replaced by a strange feeling of isolation. We parked near the water's edge, the gravel crunching beneath our tires. The lake stretched out before us, its surface calm and glassy. My parents unpacked the cooler while my younger siblings ran ahead, eager to dip their toes into the chilly water. I stayed back, sitting on the hood of the car, watching them. The sun had almost fully set now, casting long shadows across the trees that framed the lake. There was something in those shadows that didn't feel right. A stillness, unnatural, almost as if the world had stopped turning. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper carried on the wind. It was faint, almost inaudible, but I could feel its pull. My head snapped toward the woods behind the lake. There was no one there, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination. But the longer I sat there, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. My parents were still chatting by the car, unaware of the unease that had settled over me. I got up and walked toward the water's edge, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers were clearer now, though they seemed to come from nowhere. I kept turning in circles, looking around, but there was no one. "Hey," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. But then I noticed something strange. Footprints leading down toward the water. They weren't ours. They were small, almost childlike, but the stride was too long, too deliberate. My stomach twisted as I followed the prints, tracing them with my eyes. They led from the trees, right to the edge of the water, then disappeared into the still lake. A shiver ran down my spine and I turned back toward my family. My younger siblings had stopped playing and now stood beside our parents, their eyes wide with confusion. They hadn't noticed the footprints, but I could feel their presence. Something was watching us from the trees, something that didn't belong. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We hurried back to the car, the unease now overwhelming. I didn't dare look back, but the whispers followed us, trailing through the trees like whispers of something long gone. As we drove away from the lake, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those childlike footprints, soaked in water, following us. But they were gone. To this day, I still wonder about that evening. The lake has always been a place of peace, but something had lingered there. Something we couldn't see, but that made its presence known. The whispers still echo in my memory, though I haven't heard them since, and I doubt I ever will again. I'll never forget that night. It started like any other. My friends and I decided to take a late-night trip to the old observatory on the outskirts of town. It wasn't something we normally did, but curiosity got the better of us. The observatory was an eerie place, abandoned for years, surrounded by forests that seemed to go on forever. When we arrived, everything felt different from the start. The building had a sense of stillness that wasn't natural. It wasn't like the quiet of the woods, it was more oppressive, more unnatural. The air felt heavy, as if something was watching, waiting. We approached the gate that led to the entrance, its iron bars creaking as we pushed through. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in on one side. The place looked ancient, like it had been forgotten for decades. We ventured inside, flashlights flickering as we made our way through the dust-covered rooms. The once magnificent observatory was now a hollow shell, debris strewn across the floor and old telescopes covered in cobwebs. The silence felt deafening, the kind that makes your skin crawl, like the forest had swallowed everything whole. As we made our way deeper, I noticed something strange. There was no sound at all, not even from the forest beyond. No rustling leaves, no distant animal calls, nothing. It was as if the whole world had stopped. We found our way to the control room, the only part of the building that still had some semblance of structure. The faded, old star maps hung from the walls, their bright colors now faded and cracked. It was eerie, standing in a place that was once alive with science, now abandoned and lifeless. That's when we noticed something wasn't right. The flicker of our flashlights cast distorted shadows on the walls. It felt like the shadows were shifting, moving in ways they shouldn't. I turned to ask my friend what he thought, but when I spoke, my voice barely came out. It was as if the very air had swallowed it. Something felt off. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I scanned the room. And that's when I saw it. Just for a fleeting moment, a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching, waiting. I blinked, thinking I was imagining things, but when I looked again, it was gone. We kept exploring, trying to shake the feeling of unease. My friend checked the broken telescope, pointing the lens toward the sky. "It's jammed," he said, fumbling with the controls. Then he gasped. The sky through the lens wasn't what it should have been. The stars, usually so distant and infinite, were distorted, twisted, flickering as if they weren't really there. A strange hum began to fill the room, subtle at first, but growing louder. "What's happening?" my friend whispered. I didn't know what to say. The hum grew into a low, almost mechanical vibration, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing down on us harder. It was like the world was bending, as though we were seeing something we weren't supposed to. That's when I noticed it again. That figure, tall, pale, and unnervingly still, was back, standing just at the edge of the room. This time, its face was visible. It wasn't human. Its eyes weren't empty, but filled with something ancient, something malevolent. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, as if it had always been there. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now. I could feel my ears popping, the vibrations reverberating through my chest. I turned to my friends, but they were gone, vanished without a trace. I was alone. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The figure was closer now, standing right in front of me, its eyes boring into mine. And then, just as quickly as everything had started, the hum stopped. The world went silent again. I blinked, shaking, and found myself back in the control room. My friends were there, looking at me, their faces pale. They were talking, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't hear a word. It was as if the silence had returned with a vengeance. We left the observatory in silence, no one speaking of what we had seen. I glanced back at the building one last time, the distant trees now swaying, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of the woods. I'll never forget those hollow eyes, the hum, and the silence. Whatever it was, it's still out there, waiting. It was a Friday night, and I was driving home along the old highway, a stretch of road I'd traveled countless times before. The highway was long, desolate, cutting through empty fields that stretched on for miles. There were no streetlights, no signs of life, just me and the endless blackness. As I drove, I noticed something strange. About halfway home, I passed a figure walking along the side of the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was someone stranded, maybe they lived nearby. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I realized they were still there, walking in the same direction. I didn't see their face, only the silhouette of someone in a dark coat. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and they walked as though they didn't notice my car at all. My instinct told me to stop, to ask if they needed help, but something about their movements didn't sit right. They weren't stumbling or waving for help. They just kept walking, their figure blending into the darkness like they belonged there. I kept driving, the unease growing in my gut. I checked the rearview mirror again. The figure was still there, now further back, just as distant and unchanging as before. By the time I reached the next bend, the figure was gone. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding, relieved. Maybe they'd turned off the road, or found whatever they were looking for. But as I approached the next stretch of road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure was standing there, just a few feet from where I had last seen them. This time, they were facing the road. Their head was tilted, watching me as I drove closer. I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. There was something about the way they moved, so slow, so deliberate, that sent a chill through me. I could feel their gaze locked onto my car. I tried to reason with myself, to convince myself they were just lost, maybe trying to get to a destination. But that thought didn't comfort me. There was something deeply unnatural about how still they stood, how they didn't react to the passing cars or the distant sound of my horn. As I approached, I noticed the figure wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, off into the horizon as though something far beyond the road had their attention. I hesitated, watching in horror as they began to move again, this time walking toward the trees at the edge of the field. I didn't stop to watch. I sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. Who was that? Why were they walking down the highway like that, so out of place? When I finally made it home, the house felt too quiet. I sat there, trying to convince myself it was just some strange coincidence. Maybe they were a hitchhiker who wandered off into the woods. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The figure wasn't normal. They had felt off, wrong, in ways I couldn't explain. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me jump, and every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see them again, standing in the darkness, watching. I've never driven that stretch of road again. I'll never forget that day. It started out ordinary enough. My friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to the nearby lake. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just a few hours of peace, some fishing, and maybe a swim if we felt like it. Nothing seemed unusual as we packed up and drove down the winding dirt road leading to the lake. We'd been going to this spot for years. It was remote, surrounded by trees and hills, with no cell service and few visitors, the kind of place where you could truly get away from everything. When we arrived, the sun was high in the sky, and the lake shimmered under its light. We set up a small camp by the shore, blankets, coolers filled with drinks, and a fishing line tossed into the water. It was the kind of day where you lose track of time, relaxing in the warm sun. But as the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. The first sign came when we noticed the birds went quiet. The chirping had gradually died down, but we didn't think much of it. It wasn't until we glanced up at the sky that something truly strange happened. The clouds seemed to darken, even though the sun was still shining brightly. It was as if the world had turned gray for a moment, without warning. I looked around, feeling a knot of discomfort form in my stomach. My friends were laughing, oblivious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered a bit away from the camp, standing at the edge of the water, staring out into the lake. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing at the far side of the lake. It wasn't moving, just standing there as though it were staring directly at me. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light or someone from a distant campsite, but no one ever came to this part of the lake. The figure was still too far away for me to make out any details, but the sensation of being watched deepened. I called out to my friends, trying to shake off the unease. They didn't hear me, or if they did, they didn't seem concerned. I didn't want to ruin the day with my paranoia, so I pushed the feeling aside. It wasn't until later that evening, when we were sitting around the campfire, that things got worse. The air had grown colder, the sun long set, leaving us with only the dim glow of the fire. The quiet was now oppressive, a stillness that felt unnatural. It wasn't like the calm of nature, it was like something had swallowed the sounds of the night. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. We talked, but the conversation felt forced, the laughter awkward. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling eyes on me. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked around, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. Then, from out of nowhere, we heard it. Soft, distorted whispers. They weren't coming from any direction. It was as if they surrounded us, echoing in the stillness. I strained to make out the words, but whatever was being said was too faint, too unnatural. I couldn't bring myself to ignore it anymore. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, my voice shaky. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. But then I saw it again, the figure, much closer now. It was standing at the edge of the trees, watching us. It was too dark to make out any features, only the faint silhouette, almost human, but not quite. The whispering intensified, as if the figure was breathing the sound into the air. Panic set in. I felt the cold rush through my veins, and my body trembled uncontrollably. I tried to call out again, but no words would come. The figure moved a step closer. It wasn't walking. It glided, as if pulled by some unseen force. The whispers stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I felt my friends tugging at my arm, pulling me toward the campfire, but I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It felt like whatever this thing was, it had me trapped. My friends didn't see it, didn't hear the whispers. They told me to snap out of it, convinced I was just spooked by the isolation. But then something happened that I'll never forget. The figure, which had been standing still for what felt like forever, suddenly turned and disappeared into the trees. One moment it was there, and the next, gone, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to my friends what I saw, what I felt, but they couldn't see it. The whispers returned for a brief moment, distant and faint. And then, just like before, silence. I've never been able to return to that lake. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. All I know is that something was there, something that wasn't human, and no one else ever saw it. I still can't forget that night in the abandoned subway station. It was supposed to be a routine trip home after a long day, but everything felt off from the moment I stepped onto the platform. I had just missed the last train, so I found myself alone in the dim light of the old station. The air was thick with dust, the kind of silence that feels almost oppressive. There wasn't a soul in sight, and even the usual sounds of distant trains were absent. The station had a strange, heavy atmosphere, as though the city itself had forgotten about it. I sat down on the platform bench, my phone dimming as I glanced at it. No signal. I sighed, slipping it back into my pocket. That's when I noticed the flickering lights. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced across the tiles. The whole place felt like it was slipping into another dimension. Time passed, or at least it felt like it did. The stillness stretched on and the silence grew deeper. Then I heard something. A soft, dragging noise echoing from somewhere deeper into the station. It was slow, uneven, like someone was shuffling along the tiles. I froze, straining my ears. The sound grew louder, closer. I should have left, but something kept me there, my fear rooted in place. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Then I saw it. A figure. It was tall, gaunt, and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but I could see the unsettling way it tilted its head as if listening. The closer it came, the more I realized its footsteps didn't match any human pattern. They were uneven, like someone dragging something heavy behind them. I wanted to scream, but my throat was locked in place. I couldn't look away as the figure got closer. It wasn't until it was right in front of me that I saw it. A faint, hollow glow where its eyes should have been. The smell hit me first. Something rotten and metallic. The silence broke into a low, distorted whisper, like the sound of something ancient and wrong. "Leave," it rasped, its voice sounding almost mechanical. "Not supposed to be here." In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed to run, but when I turned to flee, my legs buckled beneath me. The creature was gone, vanished like a memory. The subway station was still and empty once more, the lights flickering as though nothing had ever happened. I got up and made my way to the edge of the platform, my heart thudding in my chest. I didn't look back, and I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my home. Even now, I wonder what I saw that night, and whether it's still waiting for someone else to stumble into the darkness. The day had been perfect. We set out in the early afternoon to visit a small, desolate lake hidden deep in the hills. It wasn't a place anyone went often. Locals didn't talk about it much. My friends and I had stumbled upon it once before during a hike, and something about the isolation drew us back. The drive was long and winding, and by the time we arrived, the sun was just starting to dip behind the trees. The lake was peaceful, the water shimmering under the fading light. We were the only ones there, and it felt like our own private sanctuary. We unpacked our things, set up our chairs, and cracked open a few beers. The air was still and cool, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The silence wasn't natural. There was a kind of tension in the air that made the back of my neck prickle. I shrugged it off, assuming I was just imagining things. We spent a few hours lounging by the water, laughing, talking about nothing in particular. The stillness of the lake seemed to stretch endlessly in front of us, but with each passing hour, the quiet felt less like a serene escape and more like something was watching from beyond. It wasn't until the sun had fully set that things began to feel wrong. The faintest whisper of a breeze started stirring the surface of the water, creating ripples that seemed to echo far too loudly in the quiet. The shadows stretched longer, and we started to hear distant noises. Something scraping, dragging, far in the woods. My friends didn't seem bothered, but I felt my stomach knot. I tried to dismiss the feeling as nerves from being so isolated, but something in the air felt wrong. Every so often I'd glance toward the tree line, expecting to see someone or something. But there was nothing. Just trees, silent and still. As the last bit of light faded, we all decided it was time to head back. The trip back was uneventful, and we didn't talk much. The tension between us palpable. It wasn't until we were far away from the lake that things got truly strange. That's when my phone buzzed. A text popped up. "I'm still there." I froze. My heart began to pound as I looked around the car. No one else had mentioned anything about sending a text. I quickly unlocked my phone to check who it was from. The message wasn't from any of my friends. It was a number I didn't recognize. "I'm still there," it read again. My breath hitched as I realized the sender wasn't just talking about the lake. They were still there. I looked out the window, my eyes scanning the dark fields and forests rushing past. But there was no one. No car following us. No signs of movement. Just the empty, winding road. My phone buzzed once more, and this time the message read, "I've been following you since the lake." I clenched the steering wheel tighter. My mind raced. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. My friends hadn't received any message like that. No one could have known we were at the lake. We pulled over at a small, desolate gas station on the edge of town. The place was eerily quiet, and the flickering neon sign seemed to reflect the same unsettling silence from earlier. I stepped out, trying to shake off the creeping paranoia, but the world outside felt off. As I filled the gas tank, I kept glancing back toward the car, waiting for something. Anything. A noise from behind made me whip around. Nothing. But I could swear someone was watching from the darkened edge of the forest. Their shadows stretched impossibly long under the gas station's weak lights. I hurried back to the car, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. As I slid into the driver's seat, my heart skipped a beat when the screen lit up again. I'm still here. This time, the message came with a photo, one of the lake. But it wasn't the peaceful image we remembered. The water was dark, and in the distance, barely visible in the fading light, something moved, something tall and unnatural. The last message followed. I'll be with you, always. I never looked back as I drove. I couldn't. It was just a quiet evening walk. I lived near a small town with few places to go. The woods always felt a little too close, too oppressive, but I had always found peace in the stillness of the forest. That night, after dinner, I decided to take a stroll down the old, barely used path that led to the edge of the woods. The sun had just set, leaving a thin strip of light that barely illuminated the ground. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something faint and unfamiliar. I shrugged it off, pulling my jacket tighter around me as I walked. The path was overgrown, the grass brushing against my legs as I made my way deeper into the woods. As I moved further, I noticed how quiet it had become. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just a suffocating silence. It wasn't unusual for the woods to feel deserted, but this felt different. The usual comforting stillness was now oppressive, almost as if the trees themselves were watching me. I kept walking, pushing forward until I stumbled upon something strange. There, just off the path, was an old, weathered cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the wood faded and rotting, with a thin layer of ivy growing over the walls. I stopped, my curiosity overpowering the gnawing sense of unease that had settled in my gut. There were no signs of life. No lights, no smoke from a chimney. The windows were covered in grime, and the door hung slightly ajar. I stood there, unsure why I was even considering stepping closer. But something about it drew me in. I crept closer, my footsteps crunching against the dirt. The door creaked as I pushed it open just enough to peek inside. The darkness beyond was complete, thick and suffocating. My flashlight barely cut through the shadows, revealing broken furniture, dusty remnants of a life that had long been abandoned. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in years. The silence was absolute. I kept moving through the rooms, uneasy with each creak of the old floorboards beneath me. That's when I noticed it. The faintest sound, a soft whisper, carried through the stillness. It wasn't coming from the cabin itself, but from outside, a whisper that seemed to echo from deep within the woods. I froze, listening intently. The whisper didn't make any sense. No words, just a soft, chilling hum, as if something was calling out. I didn't know why I did it, but I stepped toward the window, pressing my forehead against the cold glass, trying to see into the darkness outside. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the oppressive silence. And then I heard it again, closer this time. A faint scraping sound like nails dragging across wood. I jerked back, my breath hitching. The whispers had stopped, but now I could hear something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the underbrush. Panic surged through me and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the source of the sound. But there was nothing there, only trees, their twisted shapes looming in the dark. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps came closer, impossibly close now, though there was still nothing to be seen. My breath came out in ragged gasps, each step echoing louder, more deliberate. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the sound stopped. The cabin was silent once again. I didn't wait to find out what was out there. I ran, not bothering to glance back. The woods felt alive, shifting around me, the trees now towering like silent watchers. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the open road, the lights of my town flickering far in the distance. Even now, I wonder what might have been waiting in the shadows. It was a quiet evening at home, the kind where the city seems to slow down, and all I could hear was the distant hum of cars passing by. The apartment building where I lived was old, with creaky floorboards and thin walls. I lived on the 4th floor, in a corner unit with windows that looked out over a row of old, weathered rooftops. I was sitting on the couch, engrossed in a book, when I heard the soft, repetitive tapping at my window. At first, I assumed it was just the wind, but when I glanced up, I realized there was no wind. It was perfectly still outside. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. I hesitated, my stomach twisting in knots. The apartment felt too quiet now, too still. I didn't want to move, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood slowly, tiptoeing toward the window. I pressed my face to the glass. Below me, in the alley between buildings, there was a figure. It stood completely still, staring up at my window. At first, I couldn't make out much. It was dark, and my view wasn't clear. But then, the figure moved closer, shuffling forward in a slow, unnatural way. Its movements were mechanical, jerky, as if it wasn't fully human. Panic set in as I realized its face was partially obscured, but I could still see the eyes. Empty, hollow, and void of life. They seemed to stare right through me, past the glass. I took a step back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping stopped. Silence followed except for my own breathing. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where the figure had been. Nothing moved, no sounds from outside. I didn't dare turn away from the window. Minutes passed, but the figure didn't move again. I was about to force myself to look away when, suddenly, the lights flickered. The entire room went dark for a brief second, and when they came back on, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep that night. It was a quiet evening when I decided to take my dog, Max, for a walk through the park. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The park was usually bustling with families and joggers during the day, but by nightfall it became eerily deserted. Tonight, though, something felt different. Off. Max pulled gently at the leash as we wandered deeper into the park, his sharp eyes scanning the darkened trees. I wasn't worried at first, having walked these paths countless times, but tonight the usual calm was replaced by a creeping unease. We passed by the old playground, its swings creaking gently in the breeze. The air felt colder than usual, and I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. That's when I heard it, a faint rustling in the distance like something moving through the underbrush. I stopped, listening. Max froze too, ears perked. "Come on, boy," I murmured, trying to shake off the strange sensation that prickled my skin. We continued walking, but the feeling didn't fade. Every step I took, the sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though the trees themselves were closing in around us, watching in silence. I glanced back once, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the path behind me was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed remained. As we neared the center of the park, I spotted something strange, a flickering light in the distance. It looked like someone holding a lantern, but there was no sign of a person. My heart quickened. Max growled low in his throat, ears flat against his head. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone had lost a flashlight or a phone. Nothing to be afraid of. Yet, as we approached the source of the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The glow flickered erratically like it was struggling to stay on. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the light went out. I froze, clutching Max's leash tightly. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant chirping of crickets. "Hello?" My voice broke the silence. I wasn't sure why I spoke. There was no one to answer. Max started pulling harder on the leash, his hackles raised. I could feel his fear radiating through the grip of my hand. I turned around, scanning the shadows beyond the trees, but they were still empty. Suddenly, the air felt heavier, like something was pressing against my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The forest, which usually comforted me with its stillness, now seemed alive, watching, waiting. Then, from behind me, came a voice. Soft, quiet, but not human. "Stop!" I spun around, heart racing. Max barked furiously, his growl turning into a frantic, terrified yelp. I couldn't see anyone, but the voice had come from the direction of the woods, clear and chilling. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. Max was pulling at the leash, nearly dragging me now. His ears were pinned flat, and he was growling louder, more desperately. I glanced around, but the park remained as silent and empty as ever. "Let's go, Max," I said, though my legs felt heavy as I turned to leave. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I could feel something, or someone, following us now, always just out of sight. The walk back was one of the longest of my life. Every step felt like I was walking through a nightmare. Max's barks echoed through the trees, but the presence that had followed us remained hidden. When we finally emerged from the park and the streetlights lit the world again, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I glanced back, but there was nothing. No figure, no sound, just silence and the shadows retreating back into the trees. I didn't sleep that night, my mind haunted by the voice and the feeling of being followed. To this day, I wonder what it was, if it was real or something my mind conjured. All I know is, some nights, even under the safety of streetlights, I still feel the weight of those unseen eyes on me. My friends and I decided on a whim to take the long trail that stretched along the edge of the cliffs, far from any roads, towns, or lights. We wanted nothing but peace, a chance to get away from everything. We parked at the base of the trail, unloaded our backpacks, and began the slow ascent. The air was clear, and the sound of crickets filled the silence. It was peaceful. That was the only word for it. Peaceful. At first, we hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through thick patches of trees that would occasionally break into clearings with breathtaking views of the valley below. It was beautiful, like stepping into another world. At some point, we decided to stop for a break near the edge of the cliffs. The drop below wasn't something to mess with, but we sat there, taking in the view, enjoying the stillness. That's when things started to feel off. We noticed a faint noise, like someone dragging something heavy. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. At first, we figured it was just the wind shifting rocks or something. No big deal. But then, the sound grew closer. I got up, walking a few steps toward the edge of the trail, and strained my ears, trying to pinpoint it. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But then, I blinked, and there it was again. A figure. At the edge of the cliff, maybe 50 feet below us, just standing there. No flashlight, no movement, just still, like a shadow cast by the rocks. I could barely make out the details, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. I called my friends over, but when they looked, there was nothing there. I didn't know what to say. My heart was racing as I tried to convince myself it was just some hiker far off in the distance. We decided to keep walking, thinking maybe we'd imagined it. The trail grew quieter the further we went, and the shadows of the trees seemed to stretch longer with each step. We came to a part of the trail where the ground dropped off steeply again, the cliff face towering above us. As we moved closer to that edge, the air seemed heavier. The noise returned, faint, dragging footsteps, but now accompanied by whispers, distant and soft. I could barely make out the words, but they sent chills down my spine. "We're still here," they said. My friends were laughing, unaware of what I'd heard. I looked around, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but the unease in my chest was growing. The figure was still out there, watching us. I could feel its presence, even though I couldn't see it. We reached a part of the trail where the trees thinned, giving us a view of the valley again. Below, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another figure standing by the edge of the cliff far below, and then another, and another, until the entire expanse below was filled with dark shapes that seemed to be watching us, unmoving. I froze. My friends kept walking, oblivious, but I couldn't move. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my voice wouldn't come. The figures, there were dozens of them, seemed to blend into the shadows of the cliffs, but I could feel their eyes on me. I couldn't look away from the sight below, even as panic began to rise in my chest. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew they were waiting. I turned around and yelled at my friends to stop, but they couldn't hear me. I could barely hear myself. "Guys, stop!" I shouted, my voice barely more than a whisper. They were already too far ahead, unaware of what I had seen. I begged them to come back, but it was like they didn't even hear me. My mind was screaming, "Run back! Run back!" But my feet wouldn't move. My gaze was still locked on the figures far below. The dragging sound grew louder again, this time coming from above, behind me. I could feel something close, closer than it had been before. I turned around slowly, and that's when I saw it. The figure from earlier, the one by the cliff, now standing just a few feet away from me. Its face wasn't visible, but I could feel it watching me. Its presence seemed to drown out everything else. The sound of my friends, the wind, everything except the slow, deliberate footsteps drawing closer. "We're still here," it whispered again, and I could feel its breath against my neck. I didn't move. I couldn't. The figure leaned in closer, and I swear I could feel its cold, lifeless stare boring into me. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. The dragging noise and whispers faded. The figure stood there for a moment longer, then turned and slowly walked back into the shadows of the cliff. By some miracle, my friends finally heard me screaming, and they ran back to find me. We left that trail as fast as we could, but I can still feel it, like something is out there, waiting, still. It was late October, the leaves crunching beneath my feet as I made my way down the quiet country road. I had decided to take a long walk that evening, needing some fresh air away from the dull hum of city life. The sun was setting, casting long dark shadows over the rolling hills, and the only sound was the gentle rustling of trees in the breeze. I'd grown up in this area, a small town surrounded by farmland and open spaces. The woods were always eerie at night, but tonight felt different. The air was colder, heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked, I noticed how distant the usual sounds of animals had become. No crickets, no rustling of leaves, just silence. Even the wind had quieted. I reached the edge of the woods, the trees towering like silent sentinels on either side of the road. The sun had nearly set now, leaving only a dim orange glow on the horizon. It was too early to be this dark. That's when I saw it, standing between two trees, perfectly still, a figure watching me from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but there was something off about it. Its posture was wrong, unnatural. I stopped walking, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could feel its gaze locked on me. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure if I should move or run. The figure didn't move, didn't blink. It was like something out of a nightmare, just a shadow in the fading light. My legs felt frozen as I tried to look away, but something held my gaze. Who's there? My voice trembled as I forced the words out. The silence stretched on, and then nothing. No response, no sound of breathing, no movement. I wanted to run. I turned back toward the road, but as I did, I saw another figure appear in the distance, emerging from the opposite side of the woods. This one was even closer than I thought possible. It didn't walk, it glided, silently, effortlessly. My stomach twisted as I realized it wasn't human. The shape was wrong, distorted, like something had stretched it out of proportion. My mind raced as I backed away, hands trembling, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was nearly at the edge of the road. The two figures, now several feet apart, stood motionless, their black, empty eyes staring toward me. I realized, with a sick feeling in my stomach, that I hadn't heard any footsteps, just silence, and yet they were there, both of them, in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I turned and ran, my legs carrying me as fast as they could, the figures vanishing into the darkness behind me. I never looked back. To this day, I don't know what they were, but I know they weren't human. The first time I saw the figure, I was hiking alone. The trail cut through a remote mountain range miles from the nearest town. I had decided to spend the weekend camping, seeking peace away from the noise of civilization. It was supposed to be a break from everything, but what I found instead was something I couldn't explain. The morning started off perfect. The air was crisp, the trees towering above me, their leaves whispering in the wind. I made my way up the trail, taking my time, savoring the silence. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the faint calls of distant birds. I reached a clearing near midday, a rocky outcrop that overlooked the valley below. It was breathtaking, serene, untouched by modern life. I took a deep breath, sitting down to eat my lunch. That's when I noticed him. A man, standing far in the distance at the edge of the forest. His figure was oddly still, almost too still. He wasn't moving, just watching me. At first, I thought it might be someone else, another hiker perhaps. But the longer I stared, the more I realized how unnatural his stillness was. His head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no wave, no acknowledgement, just stillness. I packed up my things, keeping an eye on him. I told myself I was imagining things. The wind must have carried a shadow, or maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The rest of the hike was uneventful. I set up camp near a small lake, the sun dipping below the horizon as I started a fire. That night, as I lay staring up at the stars, I couldn't help but think of the figure. Was he still there, watching me from the forest's edge? I wanted to dismiss the thought, but the longer I sat in silence, the more real it felt. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of something outside my tent, a soft rustling. My heart jumped, and I held my breath, straining to listen. There was no wind now, no rustling of leaves, just stillness. But the noise continued. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking toward my tent. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it toward the entrance. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Silence. I slowly unzipped the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The campsite was still, empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I had no idea what I expected to find, but the sense of someone, or something, out there lingered in my mind. In the morning light, I checked the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no tracks, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. I felt the weight of unease settling deep into my bones, but I packed up and continued my hike, telling myself the encounter was nothing more than paranoia. It wasn't until I returned home that I realized something was missing from my pack, one of my water bottles. I searched through my gear, retracing my steps in my mind. The bottle had been full that morning, yet now it was gone. I don't know how it vanished. I know I would have noticed if I'd lost it along the trail. The bottle was one of my last few. Water wasn't plentiful out there, and yet it was gone. I've never returned to those mountains. The memory of that figure, still and silent, watching from the trees, stays with me. I can still feel his eyes on me, even now, long after I've left the wilderness behind. It was a quiet evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive out to the old orchard at the edge of town. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the rolling hills, and the air was crisp. We had heard stories about the orchard, about how it had once been a thriving farm, but now lay abandoned, overgrown with wild grass and tangled vines. None of us really knew what to expect, but something about the place drew us there. Maybe it was the thrill of something forgotten, something lost to time. The old farmhouse at the center of the orchard stood there, half collapsed, its windows shattered and roof caved in. The wooden beams creaked softly in the wind, as if the house itself was moaning. We parked the car at the edge of the orchard and walked deeper into the field. The ground beneath our feet was uneven, covered in fallen apples and weeds. The air smelled earthy, and there was a faint sweetness from the ripened fruit still hanging from the trees. As we approached the farmhouse, the feeling of being watched set in. It wasn't the kind of eerie quiet you'd expect. No birds sang, no rustling of leaves. It was dead quiet. Too quiet. We made our way inside, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath us. The place was a mess. Old furniture scattered, walls splintered, and dust floating through the air like whispers. A sense of unease clung to the room, heavier with each passing second. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if something had been waiting in the shadows for us. One of my friends, Sarah, wandered into the next room. I followed behind, but stopped when I noticed something odd. In the corner of the room, there was a chair. No, 2 chairs. Both were facing each other, but they were old, cracked, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The legs were splintered, and dust coated the seats like a film. What disturbed me most was the way they seemed to be positioned, like they had been placed deliberately, waiting for something or someone. "Why are the chairs like that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Sarah replied, frowning. "It's creepy." We both stood there, staring at the chairs, the silence pressing down harder. I had the sudden, irrational thought that someone, or something, might be sitting there, just out of sight. As we explored further, we came across the kitchen. The cabinets were open, broken plates and jars scattered on the floor. It was here that we found the most unsettling thing of all, a photograph. It was crumpled, lying on the countertop. A family of 4 stared back at us. The man and woman smiled weakly, while 2 children sat on either side of them. What caught our attention wasn't the photo itself, but the absence of their faces. The photo had been torn, their features missing as though someone had tried to erase them. All that remained were empty eyes, hollow and void of life. "What happened here?" Sarah whispered. Her voice trembled. "I don't know," I replied, my throat dry. As we turned to leave, I noticed something moving outside the shattered window. A figure, thin, tall, standing in the distance just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out any features, only the silhouette of someone or something watching us from the edge of the orchard. My heart pounded and I stepped back, whispering, "Do you see that?" Sarah followed my gaze, her eyes widening. I saw it too. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching. Its presence felt ancient, as though it had been waiting for us to arrive. "We need to get out of here," I said, grabbing her hand. As we hurried toward the car, I kept glancing back, half expecting to see something, anything, trailing behind us. But there was nothing. The figure remained distant, still unmoving. Once we reached the car and drove away, I stole one last glance in the rearview mirror. The orchard was behind us, the farmhouse a dark silhouette against the fading light, and still I felt that unseen gaze following us. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or didn't see, but I know one thing for sure. Whatever it was waiting, and it's still out there. It was the kind of evening where the sky seemed to press down on everything, as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. My friends and I had decided to take a drive out to the old abandoned lighthouse, miles from any town, where the cliffs stretched out over the ocean like they were reaching toward the sky itself. The lighthouse had been shut down decades ago, long before anyone could remember. We'd heard rumors that it was haunted, but we didn't believe in that kind of stuff. We just wanted an adventure. The road to get there was narrow, winding, and barely lit by a few flickering streetlights that flickered on and off like they were uncertain of their own purpose. We parked the car at the base of the cliffs and began walking toward the lighthouse. The air smelled of salt and decay, the kind of place where you feel like you've stepped out of time. The lighthouse stood there, looming and skeletal against the darkening sky. Its red brick tower stood like a sentinel, long forgotten, its windows cracked and covered in moss. We reached the entrance, a heavy metal door that creaked open with a groan. Inside, everything was covered in dust. The old lanterns hung from the walls, cobwebs stretched between them. The faint smell of mildew and dampness clung to everything. We walked up the narrow staircase, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the confined space. The higher we climbed, the darker it got. The dim light from the lanterns barely illuminated our path. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, whispers, or maybe the creak of an old floorboard. Something to break the silence. But all I could hear was the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, and the soft shuffle of my friends behind me. Finally, we reached the top. The door at the top of the staircase creaked open, and we stepped out onto the balcony of the lighthouse. The wind hit us, sharp and cold, as we looked out over the cliffs. The ocean stretched out endlessly beneath us. The waves crashed far below, their roar distant and faint. The horizon stretched into nothingness, the darkness blending with the sea. We stood there, taking in the view, laughing and joking. We were miles from civilization, miles from anything that could disturb us. Or so we thought. That's when I heard it. The soft scraping sound, like something dragging itself across the floor below us. I turned to my friends, but they didn't seem to hear it. I figured it was the wind, some old creaking of the lighthouse settling into the darkness. But then it came again, louder, more deliberate. This time, it wasn't below us. It was above. I froze, staring up toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower. The scraping noise was now followed by the faint sound of ragged breathing, labored and slow, like something struggling to draw in air. My hands trembled as I pointed upward. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, but my voice was lost in the wind. My friends looked at me, puzzled. I swallowed hard, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind was playing tricks on my mind. But then came the unmistakable sound of a voice, low and cracked, whispering something I couldn't make out. We were alone up there. I knew it. The others insisted it was probably the wind or some animal, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my friend's arm and whispered, "We need to get out of here." We turned, bolting down the staircase as fast as we could, the sound of our footsteps pounding in our ears. The scraping noise followed us, but it was closer now, louder. It sounded like it was climbing after us. When we reached the base of the tower, the door was still open, but what we saw outside wasn't normal. There was something standing by the car, something too tall, too thin, with its back bent unnaturally. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a shadow, stretching toward us in the dim light. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow, dark, and seemed to burn with a cold, inhuman light. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. The others were frozen in place, too terrified to move. The figure turned its head slowly as if observing us, and then started to walk toward us. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as if it wasn't sure what it wanted. Without thinking, We bolted down the cliffside, the figure still behind us. The wind howled louder, but we didn't stop. We didn't stop until we reached the car and drove away, not looking back. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I haven't been able to go near that lighthouse since. Whatever was up there, waiting for us, still lingers in my mind. Some places, I've learned, are better left untouched. It was just a normal Sunday afternoon, and I had decided to take a long drive out to the outskirts of town. The weather was crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes you want to get away from the noise of the city. I hadn't been out this way before, but something about the empty roads and open fields had always called to me. I drove down winding country roads, surrounded by endless fields of tall grass. It was so quiet that the only sounds were the hum of the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. The air smelled fresh, and for once there was no one around. I appreciated the peace, letting my mind wander. As I drove, I noticed an old barn sitting off in the distance. It wasn't much, just a weathered wooden structure surrounded by overgrown weeds, but something about it tugged at me. I couldn't quite explain why, but I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. So I decided to take a detour, leaving the main road behind. When I parked and stepped out of the car, the silence was overwhelming. It wasn't a comforting silence, though. It felt oppressive, as if the very earth was holding its breath. I approached the barn cautiously. The wood creaked beneath my feet as I made my way closer. The door hung open slightly, swinging faintly in the breeze. I hesitated but stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint slivers of sunlight that managed to filter through cracks in the old wood. The place smelled like damp hay and decay. My footsteps echoed, the sound amplified in the stillness. The barn wasn't empty. In the far corner, partially hidden by shadows, stood something tall and thin. I wasn't sure what it was. At first, I thought it was just old farm equipment or debris. But as I drew closer, I realized it wasn't. It wasn't human, but neither was it entirely unfamiliar. Its form was elongated, with arms that seemed too long, bending unnaturally. Its face, if you could call it that, was hollow and void, no features to speak of, just a black void where the eyes should have been. It stood completely still, like a statue, as if waiting. My heart raced. I wanted to turn and run, but I couldn't move. It felt like the barn had shifted, trapping me in a place with some unseen force. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, watching. And then it spoke. Its voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a voice in the way we think of it. It was more of a whispering thought that seemed to echo inside my own head. "Why are you here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The question hung in the air, unanswered. The barn door creaked louder, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The oppressive silence returned, but now there was something else. Something watching. The figure in the corner shifted, just slightly, as if it had taken a step toward me. My legs finally moved, carrying me in a frantic stumble toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I looked back, catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It wasn't just the figure now. There were more, a dozen, maybe more, standing motionless in the dark corners of the barn, all watching me with those empty voids for eyes. I couldn't escape them. The door wouldn't open. I turned back, heart pounding, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The barn felt like it was closing in, folding around me. Then I saw it, the face of one of them. So close now. It was right in front of me, and still it didn't have eyes, just a featureless black void. And yet, I felt it staring deep into me, past my skin and into my soul. The whisper came again. Louder now. "Why are you here?" This time, I heard my own voice answer, trembling and weak. I don't know, but I did know. I knew something had been waiting for me. It wanted something I couldn't understand. In that moment, I realized that leaving the barn wasn't an option, and neither was forgetting. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A group of friends and I decided to spend the day at the lake, looking forward to some sun, swimming, and grilling burgers. We had rented a small cabin by the water, tucked away from the main shore, surrounded by tall trees. The plan was to relax and enjoy the quiet, but things quickly went south. We arrived early in the morning, and the place was exactly as we'd pictured: peaceful, remote, far from the noise of civilization. We set up camp near the lake, took out the boats, and spent the first half of the day swimming and joking around. The water was cool and refreshing, and we all felt content. Around midday, we decided to take a hike along the trail that followed the shoreline. The trees stretched high above us, casting long shadows over the dirt path. We walked for about an hour, laughing and pointing out strange-looking rocks or trees that had been twisted by the wind. It was nice, peaceful even. That's when it happened. We came across an old, weathered sign that pointed off the trail. "No trespassing," it read. We hesitated for a moment, unsure if we should follow it. Curiosity got the better of us, and one of us, the bravest or perhaps the most reckless, led the way. The trail disappeared into thick undergrowth. The trees grew closer together, blocking out most of the sunlight. It was eerily quiet now, with only the faint rustling of leaves as the wind shifted. We walked for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing down on us. Suddenly, we stopped. The trail ended abruptly in front of us, but it wasn't just a dead end. It was as if something had been cleared away, as though we weren't meant to go any further. The ground was packed hard, with claw marks etched into the earth as if something had been dragged through there. My stomach twisted at the sight. We turned back, uneasy now. As we retraced our steps, we realized the forest felt wrong. The air was thick, colder somehow, and the silence was oppressive. I could hear my friends breathing, each breath sharp and shallow. The usual sounds of birds and insects had vanished. When we made it back to the lake, the cabin was still in sight, but something had changed. The sunlight seemed dimmer, the air colder. It wasn't until we were nearly back that we noticed it. Someone had followed us. At first, I thought it was just one of our own shadows. But when I turned to glance behind us, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, far away but clear enough to make out. It wasn't moving, just watching. We didn't speak. We just bolted toward the cabin, leaving the figure behind. Inside, we locked all the doors and windows, hearts racing. We tried to convince ourselves it was just someone from a neighboring cabin, maybe a hiker who had wandered off trail. But deep down, we knew better. The figure had been watching us, waiting. The rest of the day passed in a blur of silence and paranoia. We didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the cabin made us jump. We knew whatever had followed us was still out there, waiting in the dark. By morning, the figure was gone, but the fear remained. Whatever had followed us wasn't human, or at least not anymore. The day had started off ordinary, just another lazy afternoon. I decided to explore the old abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of town, a place everyone whispered about but no one dared to enter. The house had always been shrouded in mystery, sitting at the edge of the forest like a relic from another time. The locals said strange things happened there: whispers in the night, disappearing pets, shadows in the corners of windows. I parked my car on the gravel path and made my way toward the house. The old wooden planks groaned beneath my feet, each step echoing eerily in the quiet. The front door creaked open without much resistance, revealing a dark, empty interior. Dust covered everything and the air smelled of decay. I walked through the rooms, each one more unsettling than the last. Furniture had been overturned, and old photos lay scattered on the floor, their faces faded beyond recognition. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floor beneath my weight. As I wandered deeper into the house, I began to hear something. Faint whispers, barely audible but persistent. I paused, holding my breath, straining to make out what they were saying. It was almost like the house itself was murmuring secrets, as if the walls were alive with memories. I shook off the chill that ran down my spine and pressed on. The whispers grew louder as I reached the top of the staircase. They seemed to be coming from the room at the end of the hall. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed open the door. Inside, the room was bare except for an old mirror standing in the corner. It was cracked, its glass dull and warped. I couldn't look away, compelled by some strange force. As I stared into the mirror, I saw my reflection distort, my face twisting, becoming something wrong. The whispers became screams, louder now, echoing in my ears. I stumbled back, the distorted figure in the mirror now staring at me, its hollow eyes gleaming. I could feel it watching me, not just in the reflection, but in the real world. My breath came in shallow gasps and I backed away from the mirror, tripping over the furniture as I fled the room. As I ran down the hall, I glanced behind me and caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, black and shifting, racing after me. I could hear it breathing, ragged and uneven, closing the distance between us. I burst out of the house, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside was thick, oppressive, and silent once again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I've never returned to that farmhouse. The whispers still echo in my ears, and sometimes I swear I see that shadow lurking just at the edge of my vision. Whatever was in that house, whatever was chasing me, it's still there, waiting. I've always hated museums. The dim lighting, the echoing footsteps on the polished floors, it always felt oppressive, like history was closing in on me. But on that particular evening, curiosity got the better of me. A friend of mine had convinced me to visit an old abandoned art museum on the outskirts of town. It was said to be haunted, though I didn't put much stock in ghost stories. A perfect way to escape the city, they'd said. I agreed, reluctantly. When we arrived, the place was everything I expected, a relic of another time. Dusty glass cases displayed faded paintings of figures long forgotten, their expressions forever locked in uncertainty. The air was thick with mildew and the faint smell of old paper. It wasn't just quiet, it was silent, as if the building itself held its breath. We wandered through the exhibits, the creak of our footsteps echoing off the empty halls. My friend, oblivious to the oppressive atmosphere, was too busy snapping photos and making jokes. I followed, my senses on high alert, wondering why we had decided to come here. It wasn't until we reached the main hall that the unease became overwhelming. The space was grand, with towering ceilings and a vast, empty display of once majestic sculptures. But now, everything felt hollow, lifeless. My skin crawled as I noticed the shadows in the corners of the room, darker than the rest of the shadows cast by the dim lighting. We stood there for a while, the stillness pressing in from all sides. My friend suddenly stopped, his phone flashlight illuminating a cracked statue of some ancient god. He turned to me, his expression more serious than I'd seen it before. "Did you hear that?" "What?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Footsteps. I swear," he said, his eyes darting toward the far end of the hall. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and for the first time that night, fear replaced skepticism. The silence wasn't silence anymore. There was something moving in the shadows, something that didn't belong. We listened, and sure enough, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the vast space. It wasn't ours. The steps were slower, deliberate, almost as if they were searching for something. My friend looked at me, wide-eyed. "We should go." I nodded, my body trembling. We turned back the way we came, every step now feeling heavier, every sound amplifying. The footsteps seemed closer, as if they were chasing us through the empty halls. Suddenly, my phone's flashlight flickered, then went out. I fumbled for it, my fingers shaking. When it came back on, I saw something that made my stomach churn. There was a figure standing at the end of the hallway, tall, gaunt, its face hidden in shadow. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Run," I whispered, my voice barely audible. We sprinted, not looking back, but I could feel it following. The footsteps echoed behind us, closer, until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping for breath. We didn't stop until we were well away from the museum. We haven't been back since. I'm not sure what we saw that night, but I know one thing. It wasn't human.
And yet, I felt drawn to them, as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it, the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. The windows were dust-coated, and the only sound was the occasional tick of the clock. That night, I arrived, greeted by the dull hum of the ceiling fan. The store was more of a maze than anything else, filled with narrow aisles and towering stacks of books. It was strangely peaceful, and for the first couple of hours, I enjoyed the quiet, keeping myself busy restocking shelves, straightening books, and tidying up. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. I froze, listening intently, but there was nothing there. I dismissed it as the creaking of the old building. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. "It's nothing," I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. My pulse quickened, and I gripped the counter, trying to calm myself. "It's nothing," I told myself, but the whispers didn't stop. They weren't just echoes, they were something else, something wrong. They weren't meant to be there. I checked my phone, trying to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be. I was miles away from civilization, with only the dark streets outside and the abandoned bookstore around me. Then, I heard a soft tapping, coming from deep within the store. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing louder with each step. The whispers seemed to grow louder, circling me, as though they were drawing me in. At the end of a dimly lit aisle, I found a small door tucked behind a shelf of old, dusty novels. I hesitated, heart thudding in my chest. My breath came quicker as I pushed the door open slowly. Inside, it was cold or freezing. In fact, the whispers filled the air, louder and clearer now. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Words I couldn't make out, but they sounded like they were murmuring to me, calling me. I stepped further inside. The room was filled with books, hundreds, thousands of them, but they were unlike any I'd seen before. The spines were cracked, the pages yellowed with age, covered in symbols and strange, unreadable scripts. Some seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as if they had their own pulse, their own life. One book caught my eye larger than the rest. almost glowing with an eerie, unnatural light. I reached for it, my fingers trembling, and opened it. The words inside weren't just text. They weren't words at all. They were something else, symbols, patterns, things I couldn't comprehend, and yet I felt drawn to them as though they were speaking directly to me. The whispers were no longer whispers. They had become a chorus of voices, chanting and echoing through the room. I could hear them clearly now, clear as if they were standing beside me. In that moment, I knew I wasn't alone. I slammed the book shut, my mind racing. The whispers faded, but the feeling of being watched didn't. I grabbed the nearest light and ran. Back to the store, back to the exit, not daring to look behind me. As I reached the front door, I heard it, the same tapping sound, closer than before. I didn't stop to turn around. I just ran, faster than I ever thought possible, until I burst out into the night, gasping for air. The bookstore was still behind me, standing in the silence of the empty street. And though I couldn't hear the whispers anymore, I knew they were there waiting, lurking in the shadows, always watching. I never went back, and I hope I never will. We woke up with the sun, spent our afternoons wandering the pastures, and even helped with a bit of farm work. At night, we would sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and drinking lemonade. But then things started to shift. On the third night, after a long day of helping my uncle mend a fence, I went to bed early, exhausted. I woke up around midnight to the sound of tapping. I thought it was just the wind, so I turned over, trying to block it out, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder and shifted to a rhythmic thud, as if someone was knocking on the wooden walls of the house. I sat up, heart racing. The farmhouse was old and creaky, but this was different. It wasn't a wind-blown branch or a rodent scurrying across the floor. It was deliberate, methodical. We woke up with the sun, spent our afternoons wandering the pastures, and even helped with a bit of farm work. At night, we would sit on the porch, listening to the crickets and drinking lemonade. But then things started to shift. On the third night, after a long day of helping my uncle mend a fence, I went to bed early, exhausted. I woke up around midnight to the sound of tapping. I thought it was just the wind, so I turned over, trying to block it out, but the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder and shifted to a rhythmic thud, as if someone was knocking on the wooden walls of the house. I sat up, heart racing. The farmhouse was old and creaky, but this was different. It wasn't a wind-blown branch or a rodent scurrying across the floor. It was deliberate, methodical. I got out of bed and peeked out the window, but the yard was empty, bathed in moonlight. I walked down the hallway to my cousin's room and knocked gently. When she didn't respond, I pushed the door open. The room was empty. Confused, I checked the porch, thinking she was outside. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods. It was tall and thin, draped in what looked like an old, patchy coat that flapped in the wind. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes seemed to catch the moonlight, reflecting back like polished silver. It stood there, unmoving, staring into the dark forest. Before I could scream, it raised one arm and pointed directly at me. I froze, unable to move, until a familiar voice called out behind me. Double quotes, "Hey, what are you doing out here?" It was my cousin, looking at me with a mix of concern and sleepiness. The figure turned slowly, its head moving like a puppet on stiff wires. It melted into the shadows of the trees, vanishing as if it had never been there. I stammered, trying to tell her what I saw, but my voice failed me. The night felt suddenly colder, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. "What did you see?" she asked, looking around nervously. "I swear, there was something out there," I said, shivering. She nodded, eyes wide. "I thought I heard something last night, too. Something tapping on the glass." We stood in the doorway, trying to make sense of what we were both feeling. The silence stretched out between us, broken only by the whisper of the wind. But then, from the trees came the sound of footsteps, slow, heavy, like someone dragging themselves through the underbrush. We backed away, slamming the door shut and bolting it. We stood there in the dark, the muffled sound of footsteps growing louder and then suddenly stopping. The next morning, I found a small, round mark on the window pane where something had pressed against it from the outside. It was a fingerprint, but one that was too big, too long. It had 5 claw-like indentations, as if some monstrous hand had reached out and touched the glass dot. My cousin didn't want to stay another night, and neither did I. We packed our bags and left, not daring to look back at the farmhouse as we drove away. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror was the figure standing in the doorway, staring at me with eyes that seemed to pierce through the glass dot. To this day, I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but sometimes, on quiet nights, I can still hear the tapping on the window. The last thing I expected was to find myself stuck on the side of a remote highway in the middle of nowhere at 11 p.m., with my car sputtering and coughing its last breaths. I slammed my palms against the steering wheel, trying to stifle a curse. The darkness outside seemed to fold in on itself, thick and oppressive, with only the dull beam of my headlights cutting a path into it. I stepped out of the car, the chill in the air seeping through my clothes. The road stretched on for miles in either direction, bordered by dense, whispering trees. The only sign of civilization was a rusted sign, half hidden by creeping ivy, that read Riverton 10 miles. With a resigned sigh, I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help. No signal? Great. The road ahead seemed endless, so I decided to start walking, hoping to find a gas station, a house, anything. I made it about a mile before I heard it. A faint sound, like laughter, but not the kind that comes from joy. This was sharp, guttural, almost animalistic. I froze, my heart drumming in my chest. There was no one around. The woods were still, except for the subtle creak of branches overhead and the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and pushed on. Then the laughter came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy over the ground. I turned around, my eyes searching the dark, but there was nothing. The road was empty. The trees stood silent. I rubbed my arms to stave off the cold and continued walking. Faster now. The air seemed to change as I walked, becoming colder and sharper, like the knife edge of winter. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the feeling of something being wrong. The laughter stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps following me, just at the edge of hearing. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw only shadows that seemed to shift and dart away. Then, without warning, something moved in the woods. A figure stepped out from between 2 trees, tall and thin, with limbs that bent in unnatural ways. Its face was pale, almost luminescent in the moonlight, with eyes so black they looked like holes drilled into its skull. The thing tilted its head, and then it spoke, lost. My legs locked up, and I stood frozen in place. I couldn't find my voice, couldn't tear my eyes away from that hollow, grinning face. It took a step forward, the uneven gait making the ground creak beneath it. I stumbled back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. The figure took another step, and I finally snapped out of my paralysis, turning and bolting down the road as fast as I could. The sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me, matched by that terrible, hollow laughter, drove me forward. The road blurred past, my vision cutting out between stumbles. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst, until my legs were cramping and I couldn't tell if the thud behind me was my own heartbeat or something chasing me. The woods were still, except for the subtle creak of branches overhead and the soft rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or a raccoon, and pushed on. Then the laughter came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound. It was as if someone was dragging something heavy over the ground. I turned around, my eyes searching the dark, but there was nothing. The road was empty. The trees stood silent. I rubbed my arms to stave off the cold and continued walking. Faster now. The air seemed to change as I walked, becoming colder and sharper, like the knife edge of winter. I was on my way to visit an old friend who lived on a small farm at the edge of town. The directions he gave were simple enough, and the scenery was beautiful, the hills rolling and dotted with wild flowers. But as the sky deepened to a dusky purple, a strange feeling crept up my spine. The road twisted and turned, narrow enough that my car brushed the bushes on either side. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving together like a canopy, blocking out most of the light. I knew I was close, just a few more bends, when something caught my eye. A figure stood at the side of the road, half hidden in shadow. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching, and my heart leapt into my throat. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was a man, but his body was bent at an unnatural angle, as if he were being held up by invisible strings. His arms hung limp, fingers brushing against the dirt. His head turned slowly, jerking around as if on a swivel, and his eyes met mine through the glass. The look in them was not human, black and wet, with a depth that seemed to reach inside me and pull. I couldn't breathe before I could scream or drive away. He raised one arm and pointed directly at my car. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I hit the gas, speeding around the curve and desperately trying to tell myself it was just a hallucination or some poor, lost soul. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, but I ignored it. I needed to get to safety, to the farm, to my friend. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw him there, just behind the car, staring with those black, soulless eyes. I blinked, and he was gone. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the farm, I slammed the car door and ran up to the porch. The house was quiet, dark with no light spilling through the windows. I knocked, my knuckles hitting the wood like a drumbeat. No answer. Panic clawed at my chest, and I knocked harder, shouting his name. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, eyes wide, searching the dark yard. The air was damp and cold, and I could see my breath curling in the faint moonlight. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a movement of figures stepping out from behind the barn. It wasn't my friend. It was him, the man from the road, his body still bent at that unnatural angle. He stepped forward, and as he moved, his limbs made wet, snapping sounds. The same dark, black eyes stared at me. Before I could run, he raised his arm again and pointed a gnarled finger toward the house. The light in the window flickered and blinked out, leaving only darkness. The air seemed to shift, heavy and suffocating, and the yard was filled with a sound I can only describe as whispering hundreds of voices, too quiet to make sense of, but the tone was unmistakable. I turned and bolted for the door, twisting the handle until it nearly broke. Inside, the house was still dark, cold, as if no one had lived there for years. I swept my phone across the room, and its light illuminated something that made my blood freeze. On the wall, written in what looked like smeared ash, were the words, "He's waiting for you." The street was dark, except for the occasional flicker of the street lamps that barely cut through the night. I had taken the long way home from my friend's house, down the quiet back roads that winded through patches of woods. The air felt heavy, and the silence outside my car was suffocating, as if the world were holding its breath. I was about halfway home when the car's headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. I hit the brakes, the tires squealing in protest as I stopped just inches from what I now saw was a woman. She was wearing a long, flowing white dress that looked like it belonged to another era. Her hair was dark, tangled, and her face was turned away from me, looking down at the pavement. I rolled the window down, the cold air biting at my skin. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice uncertain. The woman didn't move or respond. I squinted, trying to make out her face, but the shadows hid it. A chill ran through me, But I told myself I was being silly. Maybe she was lost, maybe in trouble. Just as I was about to call out again, she turned. The face that met my eyes was pale and cracked, like an old porcelain doll. Her eyes were black and hollow, and the corners of her mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My heart clenched. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and sped away, glancing back in the rearview mirror. The woman was standing still, unmoving, watching as the distance grew between us. The last thing I saw was her head tilting to the side, an unsettling, broken motion. I didn't take the usual way home after that. I drove faster, glancing over my shoulder, ears straining for the sound of footsteps, or worse, the whisper of someone breathing behind me. The radio crackled, the only noise besides the sound of tires on pavement, and I twisted the dial, searching for something that would chase away the tightness in my chest. Suddenly, my headlights caught something else, another figure, this time in the middle of the road. It was a man, dressed in ragged clothes, his hair matted and eyes sunken. He raised a hand, motioning for me to stop. I didn't. I slammed my foot on the gas, my car roaring as it sped past him. In the rearview mirror, the man and the woman stood side by side, staring. A sharp, inhuman cry broke the night, and I couldn't help but shudder. The road ahead was dark, unlit except for the dim glow of the moon. I turned left at the next intersection, taking a path that led deeper into the woods. I knew it wasn't the right choice, but the thought of going back that way was worse. The trees pressed in on me, their branches clawing at the car as if trying to pull me out. I drove faster, ignoring the warning signs that read dead end. I didn't care. I had to get away. But as I rounded the bend, the road stopped abruptly, and the car skidded to a halt at the edge of a shallow, rocky ravine. I slammed my hands against the wheel, breathing fast, eyes darting around. In the darkness, I saw movement. 3 figures, no longer at the edge of the road but in the clearing behind me. Their faces were pale, eyes dark and hollow. The woman in white stepped forward, and a voice, soft and cold, whispered from the shadows, "Leave this place." I didn't hesitate. I threw the car into drive and sped forward, ignoring the gravel bit at the tires. The figures didn't follow. I didn't look back as the trees blurred past, but I knew they were watching, waiting, and whatever they were would always be there, hidden in the dark corners of the woods. The rest of the drive home was a blur. My mind screaming for me to stop thinking, stop looking over my shoulder. When I finally made it to my house, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. I stumbled inside, locking the door behind me, and drew the curtains tight. The world outside was safe, or so I thought. The next morning, when I went to leave for work, I noticed the street was silent, as if it had never been touched by light or life. And when I looked out the window, I saw the woman in white standing across the road, staring at me, eyes hollow, mouth cracked in that twisted grin. I knew I'd never be the same again. The silence outside whispered that they were still there, waiting for the night. The summer was in full swing when we decided to take a day trip out to the old reservoir, a place that had been closed off for years. It was a spot we'd grown up near, hearing stories about it but never daring to go there. I was with my cousins, a group of 4 of us in our late teens, all looking for some adventure away from the prying eyes of our small town. We drove along the dusty road, past fields that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The air was heavy with the scent of summer grass and something else I couldn't place, a sharp, metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The reservoir itself was hidden behind a line of trees that had long since overgrown their bounds. As we pushed through, the sight of the water shocked me. It was dark and churning, like a bruise caught in the daylight. We spent hours splashing in the shallows, laughing, the water cool against the summer heat. The sun was dipping, casting long shadows across the banks when we noticed the change. The air seemed colder, the laughter from the kids echoing off the stillness of the trees. My cousin, Mia, who was always the brave one, suggested we venture further into the woods, away from the reservoir. We followed her, half joking that we were looking for the ghosts of those who drowned here long ago. The forest was thick, the branches like bony fingers reaching out to block our way. It was a strange quiet, one that felt deep and unnatural. The birds had stopped singing, and I could only hear the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and our heavy breathing. Then we heard it a sound like a child's giggle, too close and too sharp to be real. We stopped dead in our tracks, eyes darting to each other. Nia tried to laugh it off, but her voice cracked, and we knew she was just as scared as the rest of us. Maybe it's someone else, I whispered, though I didn't believe it. We were miles from any other house, and nobody else had ventured this far into the woods in years. The giggle came again, louder this time, and we spun around. But there was nothing but darkness, the shadows stretching as if they were alive, searching. I was about to suggest we head back when I saw a glimmer by the edge of the trees, a figure, pale and small, standing just out of reach. It turned and moved into the underbrush. Fast, almost too fast for a person. Who's there? Nia called out, her voice a tremble now. There was no answer, just the sound of something scurrying through the trees. We backed away, the air thickening, pressing down on us like a weight. I felt my pulse in my temples, loud and relentless. We hurried back the way we came, the woods behind us seeming to watch and follow. Every now and then, we'd hear that laugh, now more like a shriek that cut through the silence, forcing us to run faster. When we made it back to the reservoir, we were breathless and trembling, the last rays of sunlight bleeding red on the water. We didn't say a word, not one of us daring to look back into the dark woods where that laugh still echoed. Fading into the night, Mia was the first to break the silence. We need to leave now, she whispered. Her eyes were wide, and I realized that whatever we had heard wasn't human. We drove back in silence, the radio crackling with static that seemed to mimic that laugh. When I turned to look out the back window, I could swear I saw a small, pale hand waving from the edge of the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. It wasn't until weeks later that I learned what people whispered about that place. They said a child had drowned in the reservoir years ago, pulled under by something that nobody could explain. They said the child's laughter could still be heard, especially at sunset, as it tried to lure anyone close enough to join it in the dark, endless water. I don't go near the reservoir anymore, not even in the light of day. Because sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear that laugh, soft and insistent, coming from the trees behind my house. It was supposed to be a simple day trip. My friends and I wanted to escape the city for a while. So, we decided to visit the old, abandoned amusement park just outside town. It had been closed for years, and rumors said it was haunted, but we didn't care. We were young, reckless, and looking for adventure. The park was a shell of its former self, with rusted rides and peeling paint. The Ferris wheel loomed over the grounds, its empty gondolas swaying slightly in the breeze. The air was heavy with the scent of old metal and something sour, almost like mildew. As we walked through the cracked entrance, a shiver ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. We wandered from ride to ride, taking pictures and daring each other to step inside the old funhouse. Its glass was shattered, and the floor creaked beneath our weight as we stepped inside. The lights were long dead, but we each carried a flashlight, beams dancing across warped mirrors that distorted our reflections. Did you hear that? My friend, Marcus, whispered, and I strained my ears. It was faint but unmistakable laughter, high-pitched and childlike, like the giggle of a young girl. Must be the wind, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the laughter came again, clearer this time, coming from deeper inside the funhouse. I glanced at my friends. Sarah's face was pale, and Ben looked like he wanted to turn around and leave. Let's just go, Ben muttered, eyes wide. But before anyone could move, the laughter grew louder, echoing through the halls of the funhouse, followed by a soft thumping sound, like small feet running across wood. Marcus took a shaky breath and pushed forward. It's probably just an animal, he said, though his voice faltered. We ventured further into the maze of warped mirrors and dark corners. I felt the back of my neck prickle as we reached the center of the funhouse. That's when I saw it, a small figure, standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. The flashlight flickered, casting jagged, flickering light. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I saw. It was a girl, maybe 8 or 9, with tangled hair and a dress that looked decades old. Her back was turned to us, but as we watched, she tilted her head to one side, as if she knew we were there. Hey, Sarah called, voice quivering. Are you okay? The girl slowly turned, and my blood froze. Her eyes were black, empty pits that seemed to draw in all light, and her mouth stretched into a smile that was far too wide, revealing teeth that were too sharp. The air around us grew cold, and the flashlight went out. Marcus let out a strangled scream, and we all stumbled back, tripping over each other in a scramble to get out. The girl's laughter followed us, echoing and multiplying as if there were more of her. A chorus of voices overlapping and splitting in every direction. We ran, hearts pounding, pushing open the heavy doors of the funhouse. The laughter still rang in our ears as we sprinted across the park, not daring to look back. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping for breath, tears streaming down our faces. When we looked back at the dark, silent amusement park, we saw the Ferris wheel. One of the gondolas was moving, slowly swinging back and forth, and then, from the top, a small face peeked out, eyes wide and empty, grinning down at us. We never went back. But to this day, I can't shake the feeling that sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of a child's laughter, just beyond my window. The road to the old farmhouse was long and winding, a forgotten path that cut through fields of tall grass and gnarled oaks. I had never been out to the farm before, but my friend Aaron had convinced me to join him on this trip to visit his grandparents. They were out of town, and he thought it would be fun to spend the weekend there, exploring and getting away from the city that had started out as a joke between us, a way to break up the monotony of our usual weekend routine. But, as the sun sank below the horizon, the light slipping into dark shadows, an unease settled over me. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field, its old wooden panels darkened with age. Windows that had once been bright and inviting now cracked and dusty. We explored the house in the fading light, peering into rooms filled with old, rusting tools and faded photographs of a family that felt like a ghostly memory. I touched a picture frame that showed a woman and a man with a young child, their smiles warm and familiar. But it was the eyes that made me stop. They looked familiar, almost like they were staring back at me. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. Aaron laughed, his voice bouncing through the empty house. He was already upstairs, calling out for me to check out the attic. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I climbed up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, suffocating with the scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if someone else was up there with us. "Look at this," Aaron said, holding a dusty lantern aloft. The light flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stepped closer and saw an old, moth-eaten trunk. He opened it, and inside were old clothes, some toys, and a small diary with pages that looked like they could crumble with a single touch. I reached out and flipped it open, not expecting anything more than gibberish. But the words leapt off the page, written in a scrawled, frantic hand. They come when the lights go out. They were the faces of those who were here before. The air around me grew colder, and I heard Aaron let out a sharp breath behind me. The lantern flickered again, and I spun around, the light catching his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open, but it wasn't just surprise that I saw. It was fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old house as if it were trying to break in. A low thud sounded below us, and then a muffled voice, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. My body tensed, and I felt a shiver race up my spine. "Aaron, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when I looked at him, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something that moved in the darkened corner of the attic. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The shadow moved, a shape that was impossible and familiar at once. A face. It had the same features as the one in the picture downstairs, but it wasn't a photograph anymore. It was real, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisting into a grin. I stumbled back, and the lantern fell from Aaron's hands, landing with a crash that shattered the glass and sent sparks skittering across the wooden floor. The room erupted into darkness, but I could still feel it moving closer, slow and deliberate. "Run," Aaron shouted. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. The voice below grew louder, now unmistakable a child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before, followed by the soft sound of feet pattering on the floor above. We reached the front door. wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The moon was a pale slice in the sky, illuminating the fields that stretched out in front of us. We didn't stop to look back as we ran across the grass, the song still echoing behind us, chased by the sound of footsteps and a voice that whispered my name. When we reached the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The farmhouse loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless, but I saw something in the window on the second floor. A child's face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and hollow, watching us as we ran away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hearts pounding and breathless. I never told anyone what happened that night, and Aaron never spoke of it again. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that house, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard the voice. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. They come when the lights go out.